Silas Crowell didn't knock. He never knocked. Men like him didn't knock on doors they already owned. He pushed it open with the flat of his hand. Not even a full shove, just a casual press, the way you'd push open a gate to someone else's chicken coop, and stood in the doorway of Lenora Voss's home with a piece of paper in his fist and a look on his face that said he'd already won before the conversation started. "Sundown," he said. Just that. One word, didn't even step inside. Dropped the paper on the porch floor like it was something he'd scraped off his boot, turned around, and walked back toward town. Lenora stood in her own kitchen, hands still wet from the wash basin, and watched him go. She was 29 years old. She had buried her husband 8 months ago. She had planted, harvested, salted, and stored enough to survive the winter, or she had tried to until the drought took everything. She had done every single thing a woman in her position was supposed to do. And Silas Crowell had just given her until sundown. If that had happened to you, if someone walked into your home and handed you a deadline to disappear, what would you do? Before you find out what Lenora did, hit that subscribe button and follow this story all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that October morning, because what happened next is something no one in Ash Hollow ever forgot. The paper said October 31st, 1888. Lenora read it 3 times, not because she didn't understand it, but because some part of her brain kept insisting there must be a mistake. Some line she was misreading, some clause she was missing. There wasn't. The language was clean and brutal: failure to satisfy outstanding debts, property to be remanded to the Ash Hollow Savings and Loan, vacate premises no later than sundown on the date above. It had a notary stamp. It had 2 witnesses. It had been filed with the county office in Harlan 4 days ago, which meant Silas Crowell had started the clock before he ever showed up at her door. He'd just been waiting for the right morning to deliver it himself, to watch her face. Lenora set the paper down on the kitchen table. Then she picked it up again. Then she set it down. Bruno, her German shepherd, was watching her from the corner where he slept, big head on his front paws, amber eyes tracking every small movement she made. He'd been doing that a lot since Thomas died, watching her like he was waiting for something, some signal that the world had stopped tilting and found level again. She hadn't been able to give him that signal yet. "Okay," she said, out loud, to herself, to the dog, to no one in particular. Bruno's ears lifted. "Okay." She said it again, slower this time, like the word was a rope she was gripping with both hands. "Okay, let's think." But there wasn't much to think about. The math was ugly and it was simple. Thomas had taken out a loan the previous spring. She'd known about it, had agreed to it, had believed in the plan that went along with it. $200 to expand the north field, buy a second plow, hire a boy from town to help with the heavy work in summer. The harvest would cover the loan and then some. Thomas had been certain. Thomas had not seen the drought coming. Nobody had. The old-timers said it was the driest summer in 40 years. The creek that fed their field had dropped to a trickle by July and gone completely dry by August. What little corn they'd managed to grow came up stunted and thin, barely worth the effort of pulling it. Thomas had stood in that field in late August, hat in his hands, and Lenora had stood beside him, and they had not said anything for a long time. 3 weeks later, Thomas Voss was dead. Not from the drought. From a fever that came on fast and hit hard. The kind that took men who had no reserve left in them, men who were already running on empty when it arrived. Lenora had spent 6 days at his bedside. She'd done everything she knew to do. She'd sent for the doctor in Harlan, who'd arrived on the 4th day, looked at Thomas, and told her quietly that it was in God's hands now. It had not stayed in God's hands long. She'd buried him on a Wednesday, in the small cemetery behind the Lutheran church, and she'd made herself stand straight through the whole service because Thomas would have wanted that. He'd been a private man who hated making scenes. She'd cried later, alone, with Bruno pressed against her legs in the dark. That had been 8 months ago. Since then, she'd been trying. She'd sold the second plow. She'd sold Thomas's horse. She'd taken in mending work from the women in town, and she'd delivered it promptly and never complained about the price they offered, which was always lower than it should have been. She'd written twice to Silas Crowell's office asking for an extension, explaining her situation in plain, careful language, keeping her pride out of it, because pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. The first letter had received no response. The second had received a reply so brief it fit on 3 lines. Dear Mrs. Voss, your situation, while regrettable, does not alter the terms of your agreement. We expect payment in full by November 1st. It was signed by someone named R. Aldrich, who Lenora presumed was Crowell's secretary, since it seemed Crowell couldn't be bothered to sign it himself. November 1st. Sundown on October 31st was close enough to the same thing that the distinction didn't matter. She had $16.40 in a tin box under the floorboard in the bedroom. She owed $230. She could sell the furniture, the tools, the wood stove if she could find a buyer before sundown. She wouldn't come close. Lenora sat down at the kitchen table. Not gracefully, she just sort of collapsed into the chair, heavily, the way a person does when their legs decide they're done pretending. Bruno crossed the room and put his head in her lap. She sat with her hand on his neck for a few minutes, feeling his warmth, feeling his steadiness. Dogs didn't understand debt. They didn't understand foreclosure or drought or the particular cruelty of a man like Silas Crowell. Bruno just understood that she was hurting, and he decided his job was to be close to her. I don't know what we're going to do, she told him. He leaned harder into her hand. She got up. She didn't let herself sit long. Sitting too long was dangerous. It gave the despair room to move in and start rearranging the furniture. She made herself stand and go to the bedroom and pull out the tin box, count the money, already knowing the number, count it anyway. $16.40. She put it in her coat pocket. Then she went to the door and looked out at Ash Hollow. It was not a large town. Maybe 200 people, maybe a few more. A main street with a general store, a blacksmith, a church, a doctor's office, a small school, a tavern, and the bank, Crowell's Bank, which occupied the nicest building on the street, freshly painted last summer, while half the farms around it were failing. People were moving along the street in the cold October morning, going about their business. Lenora could see 3 women she recognized from church. She could see Henderson the blacksmith loading something into his wagon. She could see the pastor sweeping his front steps. None of them looked toward her cabin. They all knew. She understood that. In a town this size, news like this traveled like smoke. You didn't need to see it to smell it. They'd all known about the letter before she did, probably. Crowell wasn't a subtle man, and he didn't keep quiet about his business. He thought his business was impressive. They knew. And not one of them was walking toward her door. Lenora understood something in that moment that she would think about for a long time afterward. It wasn't that they didn't care. Some of them probably did care, somewhere underneath everything else. But caring cost something in Ash Hollow. Going to bat for the young widow who owed money to Silas Crowell cost something, goodwill, maybe, or just the simpler currency of not making an enemy of the most powerful man in the county. And the people of Ash Hollow, like most people, were very careful with their spending. She didn't hate them for it. She didn't have the energy. She went back inside and started deciding what to take. The wool blanket she and Thomas had bought their first winter together. Heavy, a little moth-eaten along one edge, but still warm. The flint and steel kit from the shelf by the stove. Her water skin. The small canvas sack she used for foraging. 2 shirts, her heaviest coat. The boots she'd resold herself last spring because there'd been no money to have it done. The dried beans she'd managed to put up, maybe 4 pounds worth, in a cloth sack. A small knife with a good edge. She stood in the kitchen and looked at the wood stove. Thomas had hauled that stove 70 miles in a wagon from Harlan. It weighed 300 pounds. She thought about it for a moment, just stood there looking at it. And then she made herself look away. Some things you could take with you, some things you had to leave. She did not go through the house saying goodbye to things. That was the kind of gesture that belonged to a story someone told later, softened by time. And this was not a softened moment. This was raw and present, and she was still in it. She just gathered what she could carry, and she didn't look too long at anything. Bruno watched her pack. When she shouldered the bag and picked up the blanket roll, he was already at the door. She opened it and stepped out onto the porch for the last time. The cold hit her immediately. The serious, bone-finding cold of late October on the frontier. The kind that told you winter was not coming. It was already here, just waiting to commit. The sky was pale gray and moving fast, clouds stacking up in the northwest the way they did before serious weather. She stood on her own porch and looked at the town one more time. The women she'd recognized were gone. Henderson's wagon was gone. The pastor had finished sweeping and gone inside. Ash Hollow had nothing to say to Lenora Voss. She stepped off the porch. Bruno fell in beside her, left shoulder, close enough to brush her leg, and they walked north, away from the main street, away from the church and the bank and the painted building where Silas Crowell was probably sitting down to a warm lunch right now, and toward the mountains. She did not look back. She told herself she didn't look back. She looked back once, quickly, at the corner where the road bent and the cabin disappeared behind the tree line, and then she faced forward and did not do it again. The mountains were a dark line on the horizon, maybe 8 or 10 miles off. She had no plan beyond them. She had no destination, no contact, no one expecting her anywhere. She had 4 pounds of dried beans, a wool blanket, a knife, and a dog. She had survived worse. She wasn't sure that was true, but she told herself it was. The first day was the hardest and also the clearest. Hard because every step away from her home was a step into something she couldn't fully see, and clear because her mind was very focused and very quiet, the way it gets when there's nothing left to worry about except the most immediate things. Enough warmth. Enough water. Keep moving. She found a creek before dark and followed it north, using the water to cover her direction in case Crowell decided she'd taken something from the property that wasn't hers. She'd taken nothing that wasn't hers, but she had no faith in Silas Crowell to see it that way. Bruno waded through the shallows without complaint, shaking water from his paws at intervals with the focused efficiency of a creature who didn't waste energy on opinions about cold water. She made camp that first night in a hollow beneath an overhang of rock, which cut the wind enough to make it survivable. She built a small fire, kept it low, fed it carefully. Heated water in the tin cup she'd packed, the one Thomas had given her the second Christmas of their marriage, and made thin bean broth that had no right to taste as good as it did. Bruno sat pressed against her back while she ate. She didn't cry. She'd expected to, but she didn't. She was too tired, maybe. Or maybe she'd used up a certain amount of crying in the months since Thomas died and there was nothing left for this particular loss, which was enormous but somehow felt like a continuation of the same grief she'd already been carrying. She slept in fits, waking each time the fire needed feeding, waking to Bruno's low alert sounds twice. A deer both times, she thought, though she couldn't be sure in the dark. The second day was colder. The clouds had built overnight into something serious, and the temperature had dropped a full 20 degrees by the time full light arrived. The wind was no longer moving fast and thin. It had slowed down and thickened, the way it did before snow. Lenora knew that kind of wind. Everyone who'd spent time on the frontier knew it. It meant the sky was loading. She picked up her pace. The mountains were closer now, their true scale becoming apparent in a way it hadn't been from a distance. Not gentle slopes, not forgiving terrain. The ridge lines were sharp, and the faces below them were steep, and the timber that blanketed the lower elevations was dense and dark and held its own cold in the shadows. She had no plan to climb them. She wasn't sure what her plan was exactly. There was a trapper named Dalton who worked the upper range. She'd heard Thomas mention him twice, but she had no idea where to find him, and approaching a strange man alone in the wilderness carried its own risks. She thought perhaps she could find a way to winter in the lower timber with enough natural shelter and game. The third day brought the blizzard. It came in the night, not with warning, but with a kind of inhaled silence first, everything going still and waiting. And then the wind arrived with sudden violence, driving snow horizontally, and within an hour visibility was down to maybe 15 feet, and the temperature was something she didn't want to calculate. Lenora built herself as deep into a windbreak of fallen timber as she could manage, and wrapped the wool blanket around both herself and Bruno, who pressed so tight against her she could feel every breath he took. She was not panicking, she was conserving. There is a difference, though from the outside they can look similar. Both are stillness, both are silence, but one is falling and one is holding. She was holding. But she was aware with a clarity that was almost peaceful that she was running low on things to hold with. The cold was serious now. Not uncomfortable cold, dangerous cold, the kind that starts negotiating with your mind, telling you that sleeping would feel so much better than staying awake. She'd been awake about 31 hours. Bruno shifted against her. He'd been restless for the past 10 minutes, not frightened, not growling, but alert in the way he got when his nose had found something and his brain was sorting out whether it mattered. Head up, ears forward, turning slightly northwest. "What is it?" she said. Her voice came out rougher than she expected, scraped thin by cold and dehydration. He made a low sound that wasn't a bark and wasn't a whine but was somewhere in between. His information sound, Thomas had called it. He makes it when he knows something, but isn't sure you'll believe him. Okay, Lenora said. Show me. She was not making a rational decision. She was making a Bruno decision, which was different. She'd been making Bruno decisions for 8 months, and none of them had gone wrong yet. She stood up. The cold slammed into her the moment she left the shelter of the fallen timber, hard enough that she gasped and had to force her lungs to accept it. The snow was driving sideways. She could see nothing beyond Bruno's shape ahead of her, which was enough. She followed him. Maybe 200 yards. Maybe less. Distance collapsed in whiteout conditions, everything compressing into just the next step and the next. He moved with purpose, not fast but direct, and she kept her hand on his back as much as she could because it steadied something in her, some center of gravity that the storm was trying to relocate. He stopped. She almost walked into him. He was standing at the base of a rock face she couldn't see until she was almost touching it, a wall of stone gray even in the white of the storm, and she could feel, even before she understood what she was feeling, something different about the air directly in front of her. Not warmth, exactly. Not yet, but the absence of the bite that had been eating at her face for the past 6 hours. She put her hand forward and felt stone, and then a gap in the stone, and then warmth. Not the warmth of a fire or a building, something older than that, something that rose from below, mineral-smelling and real. And she stood at the entrance of that narrow gap in the mountain with her hand extended into it like she'd pushed her arm through the wall of the world and touched something on the other side. Bruno walked through. Lenora Voss stood at the edge of what she didn't know yet, with everything she owned on her back and the blizzard screaming around her and the town that had abandoned her 8 miles away in the storm. Then she followed her dog into the dark, and the mountain swallowed them both. The darkness inside the gap was total for the first 3 or 4 steps, the kind of dark that makes your eyes work overtime trying to find edges that aren't there. And Lenora moved with one hand trailing the stone wall and the other stretched forward until her fingers found Bruno's back again. The passage was narrow, shoulder width, maybe a little less, and she had to turn slightly sideways to get through without scraping her pack against both walls at once. The stone was cold under her fingers but dry, which was the first thing that registered as strange. Outside, everything was soaked and iced. In here, the rock was dry. The second thing that registered was the smell. Not bad exactly. Mineral. Sulfurous in the faint background way of deep earth, like the smell of a well that goes down a long way. Something alive in it, in the way that old stone carries the memory of water, even when the water's been gone 1,000 years. She breathed it in and her lungs didn't protest the way they had been outside, didn't seize against the cold. The air here had temperature to it, actual warmth, though she couldn't yet see the source. The passage opened. She didn't realize it was happening until it happened. One moment the walls were close on both sides, and the next her trailing hand found nothing, just open air, and she stopped moving and stood still and tried to understand the size of the space she'd just entered. She couldn't. It was too dark and too large to read with the senses she had available. But she could hear the water, not running water, not the fast sound of a creek or the drip of a seep. Something lower and slower, a deep, steady breath of movement, water in no hurry to be anywhere, water that had been exactly where it was for a very long time. And with that sound came the heat, rising from below, wrapping around her legs and moving up her body the way heat does when it's coming from something that goes deep. She stood there for a long moment and let it happen. Her hands were shaking. She hadn't realized until now how badly they were shaking. The kind of trembling that's your body trying to make heat from nothing, burning through whatever reserve is left. Her face was numb from the cheekbones out. She had ice in her eyebrows, and she could feel the weight of it. She was in bad shape. She needed light before she could do anything else, and she needed to do it fast while her fingers still worked well enough to manage the flint. She crouched down, set her pack on the ground, and felt through it by touch. The flint kit was in the outer pocket. She'd packed it there deliberately, exactly for a situation where she'd need it fast and in the dark. She had dry tinder in a small oilcloth pouch. She had a few sticks of fat wood she'd gathered from a fallen pine 2 days ago and kept tucked inside her coat against her body so they'd stay dry. She pulled all of it out and arranged it on the cave floor by feel. The first strike sent sparks into the dark and showed her, for a fraction of a second, the cave floor. Flat stone, dust, perfectly dry. And Bruno's face about 3 feet away, watching her with complete attention. The second strike caught the tinder. She fed it carefully, the way Thomas had taught her in the first year of their marriage, when neither of them had known much about anything, and they'd been learning everything at the same time. Small things first, then larger. Never rush the fire. Never smother it with wanting. She'd been impatient about that for years. She wasn't impatient anymore. The flame grew. And by its light, Lenora Voss saw the cavern for the first time. It was enormous. She'd been in caves before, small ones, the kind you find tucked under rock shelves in the hills, barely big enough to sit in. This was something different. The ceiling went up maybe 30 feet at its peak, arching overhead in natural columns of stone that caught the firelight and held it in warm amber tones. And the walls curved outward in both directions to a width that she couldn't fully see even now. The floor was stone, largely flat with occasional rises and dips, and it ran back into the mountain maybe 60 or 70 feet before the firelight gave out and darkness took over. And at the far end, visible even from where she was, a faint shimmer in the dark. The hot spring. She picked up the burning stick and carried it forward, past Bruno who fell in beside her, across the uneven floor. The warmth got stronger as she moved toward the back of the cavern, and by the time she was 20 feet from the water she could feel it on her face. Genuine warmth, not comfortable exactly, but the kind that makes your skin wake up and start remembering it's supposed to be alive. The spring was maybe 12 feet across at its widest point, roughly oval, set into a natural depression in the stone floor. The water was dark and still looking on the surface, but not still. She could see the faint movement of it, the slow upwelling from somewhere below, and steam rose from it in thin pale threads that drifted up toward the ceiling and disappeared. She reached down and touched the surface with 2 fingers, pulled them back fast. Hot. Not scalding, but seriously hot. The kind of temperature you'd heat a bath to if you had the patience for it. Hot enough that she understood immediately what had kept this cavern livable through the mountain winter while everything outside died. She sat down right there on the cave floor beside the spring and did not move for a full minute. Then she started coughing, a deep, productive cough that surprised her, like her lungs had been holding that in and decided now was the moment. She coughed for a while, and it was ugly and painful, and when it was done, she felt a small amount better in the way you feel better after something bad you needed to get through. Bruno settled beside her, half in her lap, which was both inconvenient and necessary. "Okay," she said, just like she'd said it in her kitchen 3 days ago, that same rope word, that same grip. Her voice echoed faintly in the cavern and came back to her softer. "Okay. We have shelter, we have heat, we have water." She was talking to the dog, but she was also making a list, and making the list was making the list real, and making it real was the first step toward surviving it. She spent the rest of that night, what was left of it, in a kind of controlled collapse. She wrapped herself in the wool blanket close to the spring's warmth, built the small fire into something sustainable near a natural fissure in the rock above. She'd noticed the smoke from her fire drifting in that direction, which meant there was airflow, which meant she wouldn't suffocate. And she ate the last of her bean broth and drank carefully from the canteen she'd refilled at the creek before the blizzard closed in. She slept. Not fitfully, the way she'd slept the 2 previous nights in the open. Deeply, the way a person sleeps when their body has decided that the crisis is paused long enough to demand payment for what it's been through. She woke once when Bruno got up and went to the cavern entrance, heard the storm still screaming outside, and felt something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite gratitude, but lived in the same neighborhood as both. She slept again. Morning arrived as a gray lightening of the passage entrance. Not sunlight, nothing so direct, just the shift from absolute black to a kind of dim gray that meant the world outside still existed. The storm was still going. She could hear it. She lay still for a moment and took inventory. Her hands were her hands again. The shaking was gone, feeling returned, though 3 fingers on her left hand were tender in a way that worried her. Not frostbitten, she thought, or not seriously, but they'd been close enough to the edge that she'd need to watch them. Her feet were fine. Her face felt like it had been scrubbed with cold sandpaper, tight and raw, but functional. The cough from the night before was quieter. She was alive and she was intact, which was more than she'd expected when Bruno had led her into that gap in the rock. She got up and started thinking practically. That was the only way to do it. You couldn't afford to sit with what had happened, the cabin, the deed, The paper trowel had dropped on her porch floor like garbage. You couldn't afford to sit with the image of Thomas's workbench that she'd had to leave, his tools, the small wooden box where he kept the letters from his brother in Ohio that she'd never been able to bring herself to read. If you sat with those things, they would own you, and then you would stop moving, and then the mountain would do what the cold had been trying to do for 3 days. She needed to understand this place. Lenora spent the better part of that first full day in the cavern learning it the way she'd learned anything she was serious about, methodically, without rushing, without pretending she understood something she didn't yet. She walked the entire perimeter with her torch, touching the walls, testing the floor for stability, finding the natural fissures and understanding which ones took smoke and which ones were just decorative. She found that the cavern had 2 smaller side chambers off the main space, one narrow and low, barely big enough to crouch in, and one that was actually a usable room of sorts, maybe 10 by 12 feet, with a ceiling she could stand under and a floor that was drier and more level than the main space. That smaller chamber would be her sleeping room. She found where the cold air came in, a gap near the floor of the main entrance passage, maybe 6 inches wide, which was why the floor near the entrance was frigid while the rest of the cavern held the heat from the spring. She packed the gap with her spare shirt and a wad of dry moss she pulled from the rocks outside the entrance on a brief, brutal sortie into the storm. It helped immediately. The temperature in the main chamber rose another noticeable degree. She thought about food. She had maybe 3.5 pounds of dried beans left, cooked carefully, stretched with whatever else she could find. That was maybe 12 to 15 days of sustenance. Enough to survive, not enough to be comfortable. She needed protein. She needed to trap. She had nothing to trap with. She sat with that problem for a while. She had her knife, which was good steel and kept an edge well. She had the canvas sack. She had the flint kit. She had paracord, about 20 feet of it, coiled in her pack, which Thomas had insisted she keep there because he was a man who believed in redundant preparedness, and she had rolled her eyes at it at the time and was now extremely grateful for. She used the paracord that afternoon to set 3 simple snares near the cavern entrance, in the spots where she'd noticed animal tracks in the brief windows when the snow let up enough to see. She'd learned snare setting from Thomas, who'd learned it from his father, who'd apparently learned it from someone who hadn't been gentle about the instruction. The snares Thomas taught her were practical and unlovely and usually worked. She set them as close to the entrance as she could manage so she wouldn't have to go far into the storm to check them. Bruno watched the whole process from the entrance of the cavern with an expression of professional interest. "Don't you touch them," she told him. He looked at her steadily. "I mean it." His ears moved. By the 4th day, the storm showed the first signs of losing conviction. The wind dropped from a roar to a serious howl, then to a howl with gaps in it, and the snow lightened from a wall to something with occasional visibility. Lenora used the gaps to venture out and check her snares. The first 2 were empty and undisturbed. The third had a rabbit, dead, already frozen solid. She stood over it for a moment and felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized was clenched. She skinned and gutted it with more efficiency than emotion. There was something about hunger that made the usually complicated simple. She boiled it over the fire with a handful of beans and ate better that night than she'd eaten in 4 days, and gave Bruno the bones and the parts she couldn't use, which he dealt with methodically and with great satisfaction. She started building the shelter properly on day 5. Not comfortable. She wasn't building for comfort, which she couldn't achieve anyway. She was building for survival, which meant priority order, warmth, water, food, sanitation, signal if needed. She had warmth from the spring. She had water from the spring. She'd started drinking from it cautiously, just sips at first until she understood her body wasn't reacting badly, then more freely as the days passed and she seemed fine. Food was the snares and the beans. Sanitation she worked out by using the lowest point of the cave floor, near the back wall where a natural crack in the stone seemed to drain, and she kept it far from the sleeping chamber in the spring. The sleeping chamber she lined with dry grass she'd gathered in bundles from the sparse growth in the sheltered patches below the cliff face, mixed with layers of the driest leaves she could find. It was crude and it rustled and it smelled like winter, but it insulated. She'd felt the difference the first night she used it versus the cave floor. She kept a fire burning near the fissure at almost all hours. Not because she needed it for warmth, the spring handled most of that, but because fire was company, and she was alone in a way she'd never been before in her life. That was the thing she hadn't anticipated. Not the cold, not the labor, not the physical discomfort of sleeping on stone and eating thin meals and worrying about her hands. The silence. Thomas had been a quiet man. They'd had evenings where neither of them spoke much, and it had been comfortable. That particular silence of two people who'd run out of things they needed to say to each other and found something better instead. Just the presence. Just the fact of another person in the same room, breathing. She hadn't known until he was gone how much weight that had been carrying for her. How much of what she'd thought was silence was actually the sound of not being alone. Bruno helped. He helped enormously. He was not a dog who needed to fill silence with noise, which suited her, but he was present in a way that was more than physical. He tracked her moods with a precision that sometimes unnerved her, positioning himself differently depending on what she seemed to need. Closer when she was struggling and slightly more at a distance. Available, but not pressing, when she seemed to be managing. But he was a dog. And the days were very long. She started talking to herself. Not constantly, not in the way she'd observed in people who'd been too long alone and had started to slip sideways. Just narrating sometimes. Working through problems out loud. She'd catch herself explaining her snare placement to no one, or describing what she was cooking and why, and she'd stop and feel vaguely embarrassed, and then remind herself there was no one to be embarrassed in front of, and keep going. On day 9, she found the second hot spring. Smaller than the first, barely bigger than a bathtub, tucked in the lower side chamber she'd initially dismissed as too small and awkward to be useful. She'd only found it because Bruno had been obsessively sniffing at the back wall of that chamber for 3 days, and she'd finally gotten frustrated enough to go in there with a torch and look. The water here was hotter than the main spring. She couldn't hold her hand in it for more than a few seconds. And it ran through a narrow channel in the rock before disappearing back into the mountain. But between the entry point and the disappearance point, the channel was wide enough and the temperature dropped enough that it was usable. Not as a bath exactly, but she could sit beside it and let the heat work on her joints, which had started to ache from the cold and the stone and the sleeping arrangements. She sat there for an hour the first time and cried. Not about anything specific, or maybe about everything specific. The cabin, and Thomas, and the letter, and Crowell's face, and the way every woman in Ash Hollow had not come to her door, and the fact that she had been reduced to crying in a cave about things that could not be changed by any amount of crying. All of it, together, which is how grief tends to come when you've been too busy surviving to let it in. Bruno sat in the entrance to the side chamber and watched her and made no attempt to intervene or comfort. He just witnessed. Sometimes that was the right thing. When she was done, she washed her face in the cooler lower section of the channel and went back to work. By the end of the second week, the storm had fully broken. She knew it before she saw the sky change. She felt it in the air pressure, in the subtle shift in how sound moved through the cavern, in the fact that Bruno started spending more time at the entrance looking out rather than staying deep inside with her. She went to the entrance and looked out at a world that had been buried. Snow. Everywhere, in every direction, an unbroken white that caught the thin winter sunlight and threw it back hard enough to sting her eyes. The trees below the cliff were loaded to breaking. The animal trails she'd been using to check her snares had been erased and would need to be refound. It was beautiful in the completely impartial way that nature is sometimes beautiful, without any interest in whether you find it beautiful or terrifying. She was resetting the third snare, the most productive one, down about 40 yards from the entrance along the cliff face, when she heard it. A sound that didn't belong to winter or wind or wildlife. A ragged, gasping kind of sound. She straightened and turned, and Bruno was already turned toward the source, ears forward, tail neutral. Not afraid, not threatening, just assessing. She put her hand on his back. A man appeared through the tree line. I was moving badly. One hand against the tree trunks for support, the other wrapped across his chest, and his gait was the staggering, forward-tilting walk of someone who had been cold for too long and was running on whatever animal instinct precedes actual collapse. He was wearing a trapper's coat, heavy, oilskin over wool, but it was crusted with ice along every seam, and his face, what she could see of it under the frost-covered beard, was the gray-white color that meant he was close to the edge. He hadn't seen her yet. He was following the steam. The thin columns of it that rose from the cavern entrance and drifted up the cliff face. She'd wondered sometimes if anyone would notice that, if it was visible from below, if it would draw attention she didn't want. Apparently it was, and apparently it did. He raised his head and saw her standing there with her hand on her dog, and he stopped completely, like he'd walked into something solid. "You're real," he said. It was barely audible. "Last I checked," Lenora said, "I thought—" He stopped, swallowed. "I saw the steam, and I thought there was a fire maybe, somebody's camp." He squinted at her. "You're a woman." "Still correct," Lenora said. He blinked at her like he was having trouble organizing the information. "What are you doing up here?" She looked at him for a moment. The ice in his beard, the way his shoulders were shaking even now, even standing still, the blue tinge at the corners of his lips. She made a decision based on the simple arithmetic of it. She could turn this man away, and he would probably die before he got back to the tree line, or she could bring him in. "I live here," she said. "Come inside before you fall down." He made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Live here," he repeated, like the words didn't fit together properly. "Can you walk?" He looked at his own legs as though consulting them. Yes, I think so." He followed her to the entrance and through the passage, and she heard him behind her, heard his breathing change when the warmth hit him, heard the sharp, involuntary sound he made when the cold in his body started releasing its grip, which is always painful, the thawing out, always worse in some ways than the freezing. She brought him to the fire near the main spring and told him to sit. He sat. She studied him while she put water on to boil. A big man, heavy-set through the shoulders, maybe 50 years old. It was hard to tell under the frost and the beard. He had a trapper's equipment on him, what she could see of it, a knife on his belt, a pack that he let slide off his shoulders with the exhausted deliberateness of someone who'd been carrying it a long time, snowshoes strapped to the outside of the pack. His hands were rough and large and currently the wrong color. "Orson Pike," he said after a while. "Lenora Voss." He turned to look at her then, really look, and she could see the recognition working its way through the cold and the exhaustion, slow but arriving. "Voss," he said. "Thomas Voss's wife." "Widow," she said. It still came out flat when she said it, like a word she hadn't fully made peace with yet. "I heard about Thomas," he said. "I'm sorry. He was a decent man." He paused. "They said you—" He stopped. "They said I walked off into the mountains in October and died," she said. "I know what they said. I'm standing here." Orson Pike looked around the cavern, really looked, taking it in the way a man takes in something his mind isn't prepared for. The size of it. The spring. The fire built under natural ventilation. The sleeping arrangements visible through the side chamber entrance. The snares hung by the door to thaw. The small stack of supplies organized against the wall. Not comfortable, not elegant, but functional in a way that spoke of weeks of careful, deliberate work. "You built all this," he said. "There wasn't anyone else to do it." He was quiet for a moment, processing. The water came to a boil and she made thin bean soup with a piece of the smoked rabbit she'd been conserving, and she gave him the larger portion because he needed it more, which she didn't say aloud. He ate without speaking, and she sat across the fire from him and waited. "Storms broke," he said finally. "I noticed. There's more coming, though. I've been trapping this range for 20 years. The way the light sits, the way the ice is building on the lower creeks, we're not even at the worst of it yet." He looked at his soup bowl. "This has been the coldest October in memory, and November hasn't started." Lenora knew this. She'd felt it. The particular quality of the cold, the way it had settled in like something that had decided to stay, not just pass through. She'd been rationing accordingly. "How's the town?" she said. She tried to make it neutral, just information. Orson looked up at her. Something moved across his face. Not quite guilt, but adjacent to it. "It's bad," he said. "Railroad's been blocked since the 3rd week of October. Supply wagon out of Harlan couldn't get through. Firewood's being rationed." He paused. "People are sick. Not just a cold. Something in the lungs. Beckett's daughter, the mayor's girl, she took sick last week. She's 8 years old." Lenora said nothing. "Old Mrs. Helfer died," Orson continued, looking at his hands now. "She was 73, so it wasn't unexpected, but still. And the Garver family, out on the East Road, their roof collapsed under the snow load. All 4 of them moved in with the pastor." "And Crowell?" she said. Orson's jaw tightened slightly. Crowell's fine. His building's the best constructed one in town. He's got stores. A pause. He's talking about charging for firewood from the town's emergency reserve. Lenora stared at him. Hasn't done it yet, Orson said quickly. Beckett's pushing back, but he's talking about it. She stood up and went to check on the fire, not because it needed checking, but because she needed to stand up and move. She added a small piece of wood, waited until the flame accepted it. She had thought sometimes, in the weeks since October, about what was happening in Ash Hollow. She'd tried not to. It was a habit of mine she'd been trying to break. The picking at wound habit, the returning to the thing that hurt. Because, at least when you were hurting on purpose, it felt like you had some control over it. She'd tried to think about what was in front of her instead. But she'd thought about it anyway. She turned back to face Orson Pike, who was watching her with the careful attention of a man who had been alone in the wilderness long enough to have gotten good at reading people. "Why did you come up the mountain?" she asked. "In that weather." "Got turned around in the whiteout," he said. "I was running a line on the north face, and the storm came in faster than I expected. I'd been moving for maybe 6 hours trying to find my bearings." He gestured toward the entrance. "Saw the steam when the wind dropped for a minute. Figured it was somebody's fire. You were close to done." "I was close to done," he agreed. No drama in it. Just a man who had been in enough bad situations to know what they looked like. "You can stay until you're warm," she said. "Until you're right. Then I need you to think carefully about what you tell people when you get back to town." He looked at her steadily. "About this place, you mean?" "Yes." He was quiet for a long moment. She could see him working through it. Not dishonestly, not strategically, just genuinely thinking about what she was asking and what it meant. "People are dying, Mrs. Voss," he said. "I know that. Not all of them, but some of them might. I know that too. And you're—" He stopped and started again. "This place. What you've got here. There's room. The spring could keep a lot of people warm." Lenora sat back down across from him. She looked at the fire for a moment, and then at Bruno, who was lying between them in the exact center of the available warmth, with the air of a creature who had made his domestic arrangements and was satisfied with them. "Those people watched Silas Crowell hand me a piece of paper that took my home," she said. "Every person in Ash Hollow. They were behind their windows, and they watched him do it, and not one of them came to my door." "I know," Orson said. "I walked out of that town with what I could carry on my back, in October, with my dog." Her voice was level. She told herself this would be level, and it was. "I didn't ask anyone for help because it was clear there wasn't any coming." "I know," he said again, and the repetition of it wasn't weak. He said it like a man who understood he was agreeing to something uncomfortable and was doing it anyway because it was true. "I'm not saying I won't help them," she said. "I'm saying I need to think about whether I do. And I need you to give me that space." Orson picked up his soup bowl and turned it slowly in his large, thawing hands. He looked at the spring, at the cavern ceiling, at the side chamber with its insulated floor. "How long have you been here, so?" he said. "Since the first blizzard, 2 weeks, roughly." "By yourself?" "With Bruno." He glanced at the dog. "That's a fine animal." "He found this place," she said. "I'd have died without him." Orson nodded slowly, like something was settling into place in his understanding of the situation. He set the bowl down. He straightened his back, which clearly cost him something. "I'll stay one night," he said. "My feet need to be right before I travel, and then I'll go back to town." He met her eyes directly. "I won't lie to them, but I won't tell them what to do with what I tell them. That's the most I can offer you." Lenora considered this. A man who wouldn't lie for her was also a man who wouldn't lie against her. That was something. "Fair enough," she said. Orson Pike slept that night in the main chamber near the spring, wrapped in his own gear plus the extra blanket she lent him, and he snored with the comfortable consistency of a man who'd made peace with his own noise decades ago. Lenora lay in the side chamber listening to it, which was strange but not unwelcome. The sound of another person breathing. She woke in the gray morning to find Bruno sitting at the chamber entrance looking toward the main room, and Orson Pike already up and dressed and standing at the cavern entrance, looking out at the world. She came up beside him. The sky was clear for the first time in weeks, pale winter blue, and the sunlight on the snow was blinding. It was bitterly cold. She could feel it from inside the entrance. But the storm was genuinely done, for now. I need to set my feet right and then I'll go, Orson said. I know. He looked out at the mountains for another moment, and then he said without looking at her, For what it's worth, Mrs. Voss, what you've done up here, what you built. He shook his head slightly. Thomas would have been proud. She didn't answer for a moment. The mention of Thomas in her chest was a small, specific pain, there and gone. He would have wanted to redesign the snares, she said. Orson actually laughed. It was a short, real sound that bounced off the stone walls. He left by mid-morning, moving well enough on his snowshoes, his pack resupplied with a portion of her stores that she gave him without being asked, because if he didn't make it back to town, everything he carried came back to her, and the odds were better spent on him surviving. She watched him until the tree line took him, and then she stood for a while longer, looking at the valley below and the faint dark smear in the distance that was Ash Hollow. She could feel what was coming. She didn't know the shape of it yet, the timing or the specific weight of it, but she could feel it the way you feel weather, in the quality of the air, in the pressure of things unsaid. Whatever was going to happen next, it was already in motion. She turned back to the cavern. She had work to do. Orson Pike was gone 4 days before anything happened. Lenora knew because she counted. Not obsessively, she wasn't standing at the cavern entrance marking time, but the way you count when you're alone and the days have weight to them, when each one has to be accounted for and used and put away before the next one arrives. She set her snares. She checked them. She boiled water and rationed beans and spent an afternoon reinforcing the packed moss draft. Seal at the entrance because she'd noticed cold air finding its way back in along the bottom. She let herself sit for an hour each evening by the smaller spring in the side chamber, the hot one, the one she'd started thinking of privately as hers, and she let the heat work on the deep ache in her lower back that had arrived sometime in week 2 and refused to leave. She did not let herself think too much about what Orson would tell them. She thought about it constantly. On the 4th morning, she woke to Bruno already on his feet, facing the entrance, tail low and still. Not the neutral assessment posture he'd taken when Orson appeared. Something edgier than that. Multiple sources of sound, she understood, from the way he was tracking. His head moved incrementally, left to right, like he was reading something she couldn't hear yet. She was up and dressed before the first voice carried through the passage. She couldn't make out words. Just the sound of more than one man, outdoors nearby, which in 20-odd days of solitude had become a startling and complicated thing to register. Bruno looked at her. She put her hand on his neck, just briefly, and then moved to the entrance passage and pressed herself flat against the wall just inside the opening. Boots on snow. More than 2 sets. The creak of snowshoes. Someone breathing hard from the climb. Can't be right, Orson. A woman up here alone for 3 weeks. I'm telling you what I saw, Mayor. I'm not embellishing. And the spring? Underground? You're certain it wasn't? I drank the water. I slept warm without a fire for most of the night. I'm certain. A pause. More footsteps. Then a 4th voice, lower and smoother than the others. And that smoothness was the thing that told her who it was before he said a single identifiable word. Silas Crowell had a particular quality to his voice. Not loud, never loud, but with a professional certainty in it, like every sentence he spoke had already been agreed upon by everyone in the room. Regardless of what Pike found, the question of land ownership needs to be settled before anything else. Lenora's hand tightened on the stone wall. She stepped out of the passage and into the thin winter sunlight. There were 5 of them. Orson Pike, who saw her first and gave a small, complicated nod, not apologetic exactly, but acknowledging the difficulty of what was happening. Mayor Harlan Beckett, a thick-built man in his 50s with an authority that sat well on him because he didn't work too hard at it. 2 men she recognized from town, Walt Garver and someone from the church whose name she couldn't immediately pull up, and Silas Crowell, standing slightly apart from the others in a good coat and leather gloves, looking at the cavern entrance with the expression of a man pricing a piece of land. He hadn't looked at her yet. Beckett had. Beckett looked at her with something she recognized as genuine surprise, though he was controlling it carefully. He'd been mayor long enough to have learned that showing too much of what you felt was a disadvantage. Mrs. Voss, he said. He made it sound like a statement of fact and a greeting at the same time, which was a skill she had to give him. Mayor Beckett. He gestured vaguely at the cavern entrance, at the cliff face, at the situation in general. You've been living here, yes, since October. Since October 31st. She let that date sit in the air without comment. Beckett received it. She could see him receiving it, filing it away somewhere in the responsible part of his conscience where things like that got stored. "May we come in?" he said. It was the right thing to ask. She noticed that he asked. She noticed Crowell, slightly behind him, who had not asked anything and whose eyes were moving along the visible edge of the cliff face with the systematic efficiency of someone calculating square footage. "Mayer and Orson," she said. "Yes." Beckett turned slightly, understanding. Crowell looked at her for the first time. His face was composed, not surprised, not offended, just registering. "Mrs. Voss," he said, I don't think there's any need to be—" "The other two gentlemen can wait out here," Lenora said, without inflection. "Mr. Crowell, I don't believe I invited you at all." A silence. The cold air moved through it. Orson Pike looked at his snowshoes. Crowell's composure didn't crack. It didn't need to crack. Men like him had other tools. He shifted his weight slightly, tilted his head, produced a small and perfectly patient smile. "I understand you're upset, Mrs. Voss. Given what you've been through, that's completely—" "I'm not upset," she said. "I'm cold. And I'm speaking plainly because plain speech saves time." She looked at Beckett. "You came to see the spring. I'll show you the spring. Mr. Crowell can look at the entrance from here, which is more than he deserves, and make whatever plans he's already making in his head." The composed smile stayed exactly where it was on Crowell's face, but something behind it changed. Something went from warm to not warm, like a lamp turned down but not out. Beckett followed her in, Orson behind him. She heard Crowell say something to the other two men outside, low, and she didn't try to catch it. She knew what a man like Crowell did when he was refused something. He started making alternate arrangements. He'd been doing it since before she was born. Inside, Beckett went through the same sequence of adjustments that Orson had gone through, though he was quieter about it. The hesitation at the darkness of the passage, the physical response when the warmth hit him, the pause when the cavern opened up and he understood its scale. He walked toward the main spring slowly, stopping a few feet from the edge, looking at the steam rising from the dark water. "Lord," he said quietly. Lenora didn't comment on that. "How hot is it?" he said. "Hot enough to keep this entire space above 40 degrees in a blizzard," she said. "Hot enough to cook with if you're careful, not hot enough to burn you if you're paying attention." She paused. "There's a second, smaller spring in the side chamber. Hotter. I use it for warming through." Beckett turned and looked at the cavern properly. The sleeping chamber, the fire station she'd built under the ventilation fissure, the organized supplies, the snares, all of it. She watched him taking it in and understood that he was doing math. Not Crowell's math, not square footage and ownership, a different kind of math. "How many people could this hold?" he said. "Comfortably? 30? Maybe 35 if you use the entrance passage and the smaller chamber both." She knew this number because she'd been calculating it for 4 days. "Not comfortably." "Meaning survivably?" "More. 50, maybe. It depends on what they bring and how they behave." Beckett turned to look at her then, full on, and she held his gaze without difficulty. "Mrs. Voss," he said, "I want to speak plainly with you too." "Please," he exhaled. "The town is in trouble. I'm not going to dress that up. The railroad's been closed for 5 weeks. I sent 2 riders to Harlan 3 weeks ago. I haven't heard back and I'm not confident I will. We have firewood for maybe another 2 weeks at current usage, and I've already cut usage to the point where people are sleeping in their coats." He paused. "I have a doctor in town who hasn't slept a full night in 10 days. I have 11 people sick with something that he's calling a lung infection, and 3 of them are children." Another pause, shorter. "My daughter is one of them." Lenora was quiet. "She's 8, he said. Not asking for sympathy, just establishing facts. "Her name is Clara. She's been feverish for 6 days. Orson, standing near the fire, studied the cave floor. "And what do you want from me, Mayor?" Lenora said. "I want to bring people here," he said. "Not everyone. The ones who can't stay warm, the sick, the elderly, the families with young children. I want to bring them here, and I want to use this place the way you've been using it, to keep them alive until the weather breaks or help arrives." And what does Silas Crowell want? Beckett's jaw tightened. He was not a dishonest man, and he clearly didn't enjoy the position he'd been placed in. Crowell has raised the question of land title. He's suggested that since the original homestead deed reverted to the bank's holding, and since this land falls within, he wants to own this too, Lenora said. He hasn't formally filed anything. He will. Beckett didn't deny it. She walked to the fire and stood facing it for a moment, her back to both of them. She could feel the situation pressing on her from all sides. The dying town behind her on the mountain, Clara Beckett's fever, the image of Silas Crowell standing outside calculating value on land he had no claim to, and underneath all of it, her own anger, which was real and not going anywhere, and was not something she was going to apologize for. Thomas would have told her to help. He'd have said it quietly, without pressure, the way he said the things he was certain about. You know what to do, Lenora. He'd have been right, and she'd have been irritated about it, and she'd have done it anyway. She was still irritated about it. She turned back to Beckett. Here are my terms, she said. He went very still in the way that people go still when they realize a negotiation has started and they don't yet know the terms. This place is mine, she said. I found it. I built what's here. If people come, they come under my rules, not Crowell's, not yours, not anyone else's. Food distribution, sleeping arrangements, use of the water, my decisions, non-negotiable. Beckett nodded. Agreed. If Crowell files any claim to this land while I'm housing his town's citizens, the town gets nothing more from me. I will close that entrance, and I will let every single one of those people spend the winter in Ash Hollow, and whatever happens, happens. She held his gaze. I want that understood before anyone comes up that mountain. Understood, Beckett said. He said it like he meant it. And afterward, she said, when the winter's over, I want the question of this land settled in writing properly by someone who knows land law in a way that cannot be challenged by Silas Crowell or anyone else. Beckett was quiet for a moment. That's a reasonable request, he said. I can't promise the outcome, but I can promise the process. That'll do for now, she said. Go back to town. Tell them what they need to bring and what they don't. Blankets, what food stores they can carry, any medicine the doctor has. No excess. The space here is limited, and I've been managing it carefully. I will not have it turned into a campsite for people who don't understand what they're dealing with. She paused. And Beckett? He looked at her. Crowell doesn't come. Not until I say. If he has a problem with that, he's welcome to stay warm in his well-built house for the rest of the winter. Beckett held her gaze for a long second. Then he nodded once, tight, and she saw in his expression something she hadn't expected. Not just agreement, but something that looked like relief. Like a man who'd been looking for someone to take the wheel and had just found her. They left her alone in the late afternoon. She sat by the main spring for a long time after, not thinking exactly, just letting the weight of what was coming settle into her so she could feel its true dimensions. 30 people, maybe more. 30 people who didn't know this cavern, who didn't know how the ventilation worked, or how fast the temperature dropped near the entrance passage, or how much water the spring could safely support without disrupting the ecosystem of it. She had no idea what that limit was, actually, and the thought gave her a stab of real anxiety, sharp enough that she noted it. There were things she didn't know. She'd been managing alone, which meant her systems were built for one and a dog. This was different. She spent the rest of that evening rethinking everything. The sleeping arrangements would need to expand. The side chamber couldn't hold more than 4 or 5 adults comfortably, which meant she'd need to section the main cavern into areas by function. Sick people near the spring, for the heat, but away from the food stores to limit contamination. Children in the interior, where the temperature was most stable. Able-bodied adults near the entrance passage where they could be useful, and where, frankly, an adult who was too cold or too uncomfortable could contribute to the work of keeping everyone else warm rather than being a passive burden on the system. Food was the serious constraint. She was down to 2 pounds of dried beans, 3 rabbits from the last week's trapping, and a reserve she'd smoked and stored she hadn't wanted to touch. Whatever people brought up with them would need to be inventoried immediately and managed from a single distribution point. She'd seen what happened, or heard of it, from Thomas's stories of lean years before she'd known him, when food scarcity met human nature and everyone managed their own stores. People hid things, hoarded. Strong people did better than weak people, which meant the people who needed the food most got less of it. Not in here, not under her roof, which was stone and belonged to the mountain, but was hers nonetheless. She made herself eat dinner, made herself sleep, woke to Bruno alerting at the entrance before she'd registered any sound herself. They came the next morning. Not everyone at once. It wasn't the flood she'd been preparing for mentally, which she was obscurely grateful for. Beckett had organized them with more sense than she'd given him credit for. The first group was what he'd called the urgent cases, Mrs. Helfer's sister, who was 78 and had been borderline frostbitten since the third week of the storm. The Callahan family, mother, father, 3 children under 10, one of whom had the lung infection Beckett had mentioned and was breathing with a wet, labored sound that made Lenora's stomach tighten. A young woman named Ruth, who was visibly pregnant, 7 or 8 months, who had been sleeping in the pastor's crowded house since the Garver roof collapsed, and who looked like someone who'd used up most of her reserves just getting here. Orson was with them. And Dr. Samuel Hale, who was a compact, serious man with glasses and a black bag, who assessed the cavern in about 30 seconds, and then turned to Lenora with an expression of barely suppressed intensity. "The heat," he said. "Is it consistent?" "Consistent enough. It fluctuates a few degrees depending on where you are in the cave and how cold it is outside, but the spring maintains the base temperature. Near the water, you'll always be warmest." "The sick ones need to be warm and humid," he said. "A hot spring is—" He stopped, and she saw him adjusting whatever skepticism he'd brought up the mountain with him. "This is extraordinary." "I know," she said. Not modest, just agreeing with a fact. "Who's managing the food distribution?" "I am," she said. He looked at her for a moment, doctor assessing patient, except what he was assessing wasn't her health. He was reading something else. "All right," he said. She spent the next 3 hours receiving people. There was no other word for it. They came in through the passage, the old woman slowly, the children quickly, because children move toward warmth instinctively and without dignity. And each time Lenora stood at the interior opening and directed them. Old woman near the spring, this side. Family there, keep the sick child between the heat and the wall so the airflow doesn't hit him direct. Ruth, the pregnant woman, in the side chamber, more stable temperature, drier floor. She went through each family's food stores with them personally. Not unkindly, but directly. "What do you have? Where is it? Give it to me and I will give it back to you when it's time." More than one person pushed back. A woman named Dorothea Garver, wide-bodied, sharp-featured, the kind of woman who managed her own house like a general, handed over a flour sack and a side of salt pork with the expression of someone making a sacrifice she intended to remember. "Who put you in charge of the food?" she said. "I did," Lenora said. "And who are you to—" "I'm the woman whose house you're standing in," Lenora said. "You can keep your own food and make your own fire somewhere in the mountains, or you can leave your stores with me and eat 3 times a day like everyone else. It's a genuine choice." Dorothea Garver looked at her for a long, assessing moment. Then she put the salt pork in the pile. By midday, the cavern had 18 people in it and was already different. The sound of it was different, the smell, the way the air moved, the relationship between the space and the warmth. Lenora moved through the changed territory and kept doing what needed doing and tried not to think about the fact that her private world had been replaced with something else. Without her quite deciding it had happened, she thought about it anyway. On the second afternoon, the second wave arrived. 34 people now in a space she'd estimated could hold 35 survivably. The line was very close to full. Beckett arrived with this group and found her near the entrance distributing what Orson had brought up on a sled. The last of the town's emergency food stores, which turned out to be 2 sacks of cornmeal, a case of preserved tomatoes, and an amount of dried beef that was adequate if she was careful. She was going to have to be very careful. Beckett pulled her aside, which in a cavern full of people meant moving about 8 feet from the nearest person and lowering his voice. "Clara's worse," he said. "I need to bring her." "I was wondering when you were going to say that. I didn't want it to look like you were using your position to get your daughter in before others." She looked at him directly. "You are the mayor. You're also a father. Both of those things are true. Bring her." Something in his face shifted. Not completely, not visibly to anyone watching, but she saw it. The rigid, organized expression of the man holding his town together fractured slightly along one internal fault line and then reset. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Don't thank me yet. How sick is she?" Bad. He said it flatly, the word stripped of anything except its meaning. Hale says if she doesn't get consistent warmth in the next 48 hours. Bring her now, Lenora said. Not tomorrow. Now. He went. She turned back to the cavern and the 34 people in it, and the logistics of keeping them alive, and tried not to inventory all the ways this could still go wrong. Dr. Hale found her an hour later near the food stores. The Callahan boy is improving, he said without preamble. They developed an efficiency with each other quickly, the way people do in crisis situations when there isn't time for social scaffolding. The humidity from the spring is doing something I couldn't do with medicine alone. Whatever minerals are in that water. He shook his head. I want to try steam compresses for the lung cases. Use the side spring, she said. The hotter one. Get close to it, use cloth. Tell me what you need and I'll try to provide it. Bandaging cloth, clean, any kind. I'll talk to Orson. He started to leave, then stopped. Mrs. Voss. He turned back. She expected something clinical, some question about the water temperature or the ventilation. Instead, he said, What you've built here. What you've done. A pause. I've been a doctor for 22 years. I've seen people in bad situations manage. I've rarely seen someone manage the way you've managed this. She was quiet for a moment. I had a lot of time to think, she said. Still. She sent him back to his patients before the conversation could develop into something she didn't have energy to process. There were 3 more things that needed doing before anyone ate dinner, and she needed to do all of them. Clara Beckett arrived that evening, carried on her father's back because she was too weak to walk the mountain path reliably. She was, as advertised, 8 years old, with her father's thick build softened by childhood, and she was the color of old paper, and she was breathing the way the Callahan boy had been breathing when he first arrived, wet and labored, and with a sound underneath it that medicine has no good word for except wrong. Beckett set her down near the main spring. On the bed Lenora had already cleared and prepared, and Clara opened her eyes and looked at the cavern ceiling with the unfocused attention of a child running a high fever. There's steam, she said. Yes, Lenora said, from the spring. It's warm. It is. Clara's eyes moved to Bruno, who had come to investigate with the professional interest he brought to all newcomers, and was now sitting approximately 2 feet from her face, studying her. That's a big dog, Clara said. His name is Bruno. He found this place. Clara extended one small hand. Bruno leaned forward and smelled it thoroughly, then placed his chin in her palm with the gentleness he reserved exclusively for children and for Lenora when she was at her worst, and Clara Beckett closed her eyes. Beckett, crouched on the other side of his daughter, looked at Bruno, then at Lenora, and said nothing. He didn't need to. Lenora went back to work. Night in a cavern with 35 people was not what she'd expected, and she should have expected it, because 35 people are 35 people regardless of their surroundings. They were frightened and they were uncomfortable and they were in a strange place with strange sounds and strange smells. And fear in close quarters has a particular quality. It moves between people like heat moves, from warm to cold, from the one who has more of it to the one who has less. She'd set shifts for the night, 2 people awake at all times to monitor the fire and check the sick. And she'd assign them without asking for volunteers because volunteers are unreliable at 3 in the morning when their shift comes up and they're warm. She'd assigned Orson and Walt Garver to the first shift. Competent men, both of them. Men who'd be awake anyway. She'd assigned herself to nothing because she was going to be awake regardless. Around midnight, when the cavern had finally reached a kind of fractious, uncomfortable rest, children sprawled against parents, old Mrs. Alderman snoring in a way that was oddly comforting, Dr. Hale asleep sitting upright against the wall near his patients. Lenora sat near the main spring with Bruno and let herself be exhausted for a few minutes without doing anything about it. The water moved in its slow, mineral way, indifferent to the crisis above it, and the steam rose and the fire crackled, and around her 34 people who had watched Silas Crowell walk away from her cabin in October were asleep under her protection. She sat with that fact. Really sat with it. She didn't feel noble about it. She'd expected to feel something like satisfaction. Not revenge satisfaction, not the ugly kind, but the cleaner kind, the kind that comes from being proven right about your own capacity. She didn't feel that either. What she felt was tired and responsible, and underneath both of those things, something quieter, something that didn't have a name ready to hand. These were just people. People who'd been afraid and who'd made the choice fear usually produces, which is the choice of least resistance, the choice that doesn't cost you anything today. She'd made that choice herself, in other situations, about other things, and she hadn't been proud of it then either. She was not forgiving them. Forgiveness was a longer process, and she wasn't ready to start it. But she was keeping them alive, which was the first step in a direction she hadn't fully named yet. Bruno pressed against her leg. She put her hand on his back and stayed there until the fire needed feeding, and then she got up and fed it. And then she walked the length of the cavern, checking on her people, the way you check on things you're responsible for, quietly, in the dark, making sure everything was still where it was supposed to be. When she got to the spot where Clara Beckett was sleeping, she stopped. The girl's breathing was different. Not well. Lenora wasn't so optimistic as to call it that after one night near the spring, but the wet, dragging sound in it was slightly less. The fever flush in her face was slightly less. Slightly was enough for tonight. She kept moving. On the third morning, she was bringing the morning water ration to the far corner of the cavern when she heard the argument before she could see who was having it. Two voices, male, lowered but intense in the way that means the lowering is effortful, that the volume wants to be higher. She rounded the natural column of stone that divided that part of the cavern and found Orson Pike and a man she'd placed but not focused on, a heavy-set, florid-faced man named Devers, who'd come up with the second group and who she'd noticed twice now talking to others in the low, purposeful way of someone building a case. Can't have one woman deciding who eats and who doesn't, Devers was saying. That's how it is, Orson said. Flat, final. She's nobody. She's a widow who couldn't pay her debts, and now because she happened to find a hole in a mountain. Mr. Devers. Lenora came around the column with the water bucket, and both men turned. She looked at Devers calmly. Good morning. He had the decency to look briefly caught, not ashamed. Men like Devers had a very thick layer between what they said and shame, but caught, which was different, and for her purposes, sufficient. I want to be sure I understand your concern, she said. Are you suggesting that the food distribution should be managed by someone else, or that it shouldn't be managed at all? I'm saying one person shouldn't have, because I'm open to delegation, she said. If you want to count the stores and divide them and argue with every family about portions and make sure no one's hiding extra under their blanket, I will happily hand that job to you this morning and find something else to do. She set the water bucket down. There's a great deal of something else. The ventilation fissure needs checking every 4 hours to make sure it doesn't ice over. The snares outside need resetting. I've been doing that at 5 in the morning before anyone else is up because game is moving in the pre-dawn. The side spring channel needs clearing of mineral deposit buildup every 2 days or the flow slows. She met his eyes. Would you like to take any of that on instead? I'm genuinely offering. Devers said nothing. I thought so, she said. She picked up the bucket. Breakfast will be distributed in an hour. You'll get your share. Same as everyone. She walked away without looking back. Orson fell in beside her after a few steps. He's been talking to 2 or 3 others, Orson said quietly. I know. Nothing that'll amount to anything yet, but it won't amount to anything, she said. Hungry people don't organize against the person feeding them. That's not how people work. Orson was quiet a moment. And when they're not hungry anymore? She looked at him sideways. Then we'll have a different problem. But right now, let's get through today. That morning, Clara Beckett's fever broke. Lenora heard about it from Dr. Hale, who came to find her at the food station where she was measuring out cornmeal with a care that made her think of Thomas measuring seed in spring. Hale didn't make a speech about it. He just came and stood beside her and said, Clara's temperature is down to 101. Her lungs are clearer. I think she's going to be all right. And Lenora nodded and kept measuring. That's good news, she said. It's the spring, he said, the warmth and the moisture. I'm not certain I could have done this in the clinic. She handed him his measure of cornmeal, and their eyes met briefly over the exchange, a look that lasted only a second but contained more than most conversations. How are the others, she said. Improving? Not all of them fast, but all of them the right direction. He paused. There's one thing. She waited. Crowell, he said. He sent a man up yesterday. I don't know if you saw him, a fellow named Tench. He was outside for a while. Then he left. Hale adjusted his glasses. Orson thinks he was measuring the land, the perimeter. Lenora set down the measuring cup. Of course he was, she said. She was quiet for a moment, and in that quiet she made a decision she'd been half making for several days without quite committing to it. She'd been keeping Crowell at the edge of her attention, noting what he was doing, cataloging it, but not confronting it directly because she'd had 34 other things that needed direct confrontation more urgently. But a man taking measurements while your town sheltered in a mountain cave was a man building a claim. And Lenora Voss had given up one home to Silas Crowell. She was not giving up another. She found Beckett that evening, sitting near Clara, who was awake and asking for something to eat, which was a better sign than any of them had had in days. She crouched down beside him and spoke quietly. I need you to do something, she said. He looked at her. I need you to send for a land agent. When the weather breaks enough to send a rider to Harlan, I need someone who knows deed law and can file a proper claim, not a bank claim, a homestead improvement claim. I've been living on this land, improving it, for more than 30 days. In this territory, that means something. Beckett looked at her steadily. You've been thinking about this. I've been thinking about a lot of things, she said. But yes, this specifically. Crowell will challenge it. Let him. She held Beckett's gaze. Let him try to challenge the claim of the woman who housed and fed his town through the worst winter in 40 years. Let him make that argument in front of a judge in a full courtroom. She let a beat pass. See how that serves him. Beckett was quiet. Then a very small, very controlled thing happened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The structural suggestion of one. I'll send the rider the first morning we can, he said. First morning, she confirmed. She straightened up and turned to go, and Clara Beckett said from behind her in the thin voice of a child coming back to herself from a fever. Miss Lenora, is Bruno going to sleep here again tonight? Lenora looked at her dog, who was already moving back toward the girl's blankets with the unhurried certainty of someone returning to an arrangement he'd decided on. Looks like he's made his own decision about that, she said. And she went back to work because there was always more work, and because work was what she had, and what she'd built from, and what was keeping every single person in that cavern alive, including herself. The rider Beckett wanted to send to Harlan couldn't go anywhere for another 6 days. The second storm Orson had predicted arrived on the 4th night of the cavern encampment, and it came without the long warning of the first one. No gradual build, no day of heaviness before the drop. It just arrived, the way a door slammed open by wind arrives, sudden and total. And by morning, the path down the mountain had been swallowed completely, and the world below the cliff face had been erased back to white. Lenora stood at the cavern entrance and looked at it. 35 people behind her. 3 weeks of food if she was strict. 2 weeks if people started making their own decisions about what strict meant. She turned and went back inside. The dynamic of the cavern had shifted in the days since people arrived, in ways she'd expected and ways she hadn't. What she'd expected, the hierarchy of need sorted itself out naturally, with the sick and elderly at the center and the able-bodied at the edges. And that arrangement held because it made physical sense, and even selfish people understood physical sense. What she hadn't expected, the community that started forming in the spaces between survival tasks. It happened quietly and without announcement. The Callahan mother, once her youngest was clearly improving, started helping Ruth with the pregnancy discomforts that had been slowing her down. Not with medicine, just with the practical knowledge of a woman who'd delivered 3 children, so Mrs. Alderman, who was 78 and had seemed purely a liability when she arrived, turned out to have 60 years of mending experience and a needle kit in her coat pocket, and she spent 6 hours the second day invisibly repairing what cold and rough travel had done to people's gear. Walt Garver, who'd come up the mountain as a victim of circumstance, had quietly appointed himself the fire monitor, and had been doing it with more diligence than either of the men Lenora had formally assigned. People needed something to do. That was the thing she kept learning. The suffering that broke people in places like this wasn't usually the cold or the hunger. It was the passivity, the sense of being carried by events rather than participating in them. When she started assigning tasks, even small ones, something changed in the air. People who'd been sitting with their fear started standing up with their hands. She noted this and used it. By day 5 of the second storm, she had a functional rotation: fire tending, water hauling from the spring to the sleeping areas for drinking, food preparation, ventilation monitoring, snare checking for those physically able, and what Dr. Hale called patient rounds, but what was really just walking through and making sure no one had gotten quietly worse, while everyone was focused on the person loudly getting better. Lenora ran all of it and slept when she could, which was not enough. On day 6, Silas Crowell came up the mountain. She should have anticipated it. Looking back, and she had a long time to look back afterward, she could see every sign that it was coming. The man Tench he'd sent up to measure the perimeter. The fact that he hadn't sent word up with any of the supply runs Orson organized. The specific silence of a man who was not being silent because he'd accepted his position, but because he was building something and wasn't ready to show it yet. She was at the entrance checking the draft seal when she heard the snowshoes on the path below, and she had a fraction of a second to register who it was before he came fully into view. Crowell, alone, which surprised her, and dressed for serious cold, which told her this hadn't been an impulsive trip. He stopped when he saw her, 10 feet away, on the path. He looked exactly as he always looked. Coat pressed despite the conditions, the one concession to weather a good pair of fur-lined gloves. Hair under his hat as neat as if he'd just stepped out of his office. I was a man who put significant effort into appearing as though he required no effort. "Mrs. Voss," he said. "Mr. Crowell." She didn't move from the entrance. He looked at the cavern mouth behind her, then at the cliff face above it, then back at her, with a patience that was the most precisely calculated thing about him. "I'd like to come in." "I know you would." "It's cold out here." "It is." He waited. She'd noticed before that he was good at waiting. It was one of his better tools, the willingness to let silence extend until the other person felt the pressure of it and said something they hadn't planned to say. She'd watched him use it on Thomas twice, in the bank, in the years before the drought, when there was still business to do. Thomas would fill the silence with reassurances he hadn't meant to give. She didn't fill it. Crowell adjusted his approach. "I have a legal matter to discuss." "I assumed." "It's in your interest to hear it." "Also assumed." She crossed her arms, not for warmth. She was warm enough inside the entrance, but because it gave her hands something to do that wasn't reaching for anything. "Say what you came to say, Mr. Crowell. From there." His jaw moved very slightly. "The land on which this cavern sits. I've had it surveyed. It falls within the acreage attached to the original Voss homestead deed, which reverted to the bank's holding on October 31st of this year." He let that settle. "Which means this cavern and the spring legally belong to the Ash Hollow Savings and Loan." Lenora looked at him. She'd known this was coming. She'd known the shape of it for weeks. But knowing a blow is coming and receiving it were different things, and she felt it land. Not in her composure, which held, but somewhere deeper, in the same place that had felt the paper drop on her porch floor back in October. "Is that so?" she said. "I'm not here to be unpleasant about it," Crowell said. He shifted his weight slightly, and she recognized the move. He was pivoting to a posture of reasonableness, which was where he did his best work. "I understand you've provided a service to this community. That has real value, and I'm prepared to acknowledge it. I'm prepared to offer you fair compensation. For a property you're claiming you already own." He paused. "The framing is, you want to pay me to leave a second home," she said, "after taking the first one." The composed expression didn't break, but it hardened along its edges, like something cooling. "This isn't personal, Mrs. Voss." "It's very personal, Mr. Crowell. It's my life." She looked at him steadily. "I'll tell you what I told Mayor Beckett. If you file any claim to this land while I'm housing the people of Ash Hollow inside it, they get nothing more from me. I will put every one of them back out in the storm tonight." Silence. "You wouldn't do that," he said. "I walked off that porch in October with 4 pounds of beans and a wool blanket," she said. "Don't tell me what I would and wouldn't do." Something moved through Crowell's expression. Not fear, men like him didn't frighten easily, but recalculation. She could see him doing it, rapidly, behind the composed face, running the numbers of how this played out publicly if she followed through. If 35 people, including the mayor's daughter and a pregnant woman and a 78-year-old, got put back out into a blizzard, because Silas Crowell pressed a land claim at the wrong moment. "I'm not filing anything tonight," he said carefully. "I came to discuss—" "I know why you came," she said. You came because you've had 6 days to think about the fact that you can't walk in here and take this the way you took the cabin, because there are 35 witnesses inside and a mayor who needs me more than he needs you right now. She held his eyes. You came to see if you could get me to give it to you voluntarily, to make it look like an arrangement instead of a taking. Crowell was very still. Am I wrong? She said. A long pause. You're a difficult woman, he said. I've been called worse this winter. He stood there for another moment, in the cold that she was no longer vulnerable to, in the way she'd once been vulnerable to it, and she watched him decide that today was not the day and that the retreat needed to look like a choice. We'll continue this conversation when the weather permits, he said. I look forward to it, she said, which both of them understood to mean the opposite. He turned and went back down the path, and she watched until the storm took him, and then she went back inside and sat down on the nearest flat piece of stone because her legs had decided they'd done enough standing. Her hands were shaking, not from cold. Bruno appeared from wherever he'd been, near Clara, probably, which was where he spent most of his time now, and pressed his nose against her jaw and held it there for a moment in the closest thing to a hug that a dog can manage. I'm all right, she said. He kept his nose against her face. I know, she said. I know. She sat there for 2 minutes, maybe 3, and let her pulse find its way back to something regular. And then she stood up because there were things that needed doing, and the things didn't care about Silas Crowell. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have seen, was that the conversation she'd just had was being discussed 3 hours later in the back corner of the cavern by the fire, where Devers had gathered 4 people and was using Crowell's visit as fresh material. She found out about it from the most unlikely possible source, Ruth, the pregnant woman, who waddled up to Lenora while she was inventorying the food stores and said, without ceremony, that Devers man is telling people Crowell has a legal right to this place and that you can't stop him. Lenora set down the cornmeal sack. What are they saying back? She asked. Ruth considered this. She was a plain-spoken woman, Ruth, the kind who'd learned that vagueness cost you too much energy. Mrs. Callahan told him to mind his own business. Walt Garver didn't say anything, which I took to mean he didn't agree with Devers but didn't want trouble. The pastor's assistant, young Merritt, asked if it mattered who owned the land as long as they were warm. She paused. And old Mrs. Alderman said if Crowell tried to put her out in the snow, she'd hit him with her needle kit. Despite everything, Lenora nearly smiled. Thank you, Ruth, she said. He's not wrong that Crowell has money and lawyers, Ruth said, with the directness of someone who'd had no patience for false comfort since approximately age 12. But he's wrong that you can't stop him. I think you can stop him. She looked at Lenora with the kind of calm assessment women develop when they've been underestimated so many times it no longer surprises them. I think you will. Lenora looked back at her for a moment. Get off your feet, she said. You've been standing too long. Ruth made a sound that was approximately yes and went to sit down, and Lenora went to find Devers. She found him by the fire, as reported, with 3 men still around him, and she came and stood at the edge of the group and waited. He noticed her almost immediately. The group's attention shifted in a way that told her he'd noticed, but he finished his sentence before he looked up, which she gave him some credit for. At least he had the backbone to not stop mid-word. Mrs. Voss, he said, Mr. Devers. She looked around the group briefly, Garver, who looked uncomfortable. 2 men she knew only by sight, both of whom seemed to be deciding whether to find somewhere else to be. I heard you've been talking about Crowell's visit. Just discussing the situation, he said, which affects all of us. It does, she agreed, and everyone here is welcome to talk about whatever they'd like. This isn't a place where I tell people what to think. She held his gaze. But I want to be honest with you about something, and I want it to get back to anyone else who's been having this conversation. He waited. He wasn't stupid, Devers. Blunt and politically oriented and inclined toward his own advantage, but not stupid. Crowell has a claim he believes is legal, she said. He may be right. Land law in this territory is a complicated thing, and I'm not a lawyer. What I know for certain is that his claim will take months to work through the courts, and that in the meantime, the question of who controls this cavern is the question of who controls access to it. She let that sit for just a moment. Right now, I control access to it. I've controlled it since October. I am the reason this spring is ventilated and safe, and the reason there are snares set, and the reason the sick people are nearest the heat, and the reason you have eaten 3 times a day since you came up this mountain." She looked at him steadily. "If Crowell wins his case in the spring, I will deal with that in the spring. Right now, it is December and it is a blizzard, and the choice is not between me and Crowell. The choice is between the system we have and no system at all." Nobody spoke. "That's all," she said, and left. She heard from Orson later that Devers said something to Garver after she walked away, and Garver replied with 4 words that Orson seemed to take some pleasure in reporting. "Shut up, Will." After that, the corner conversation stopped. The second storm broke on the 8th day. Not completely. The temperature stayed brutal, the kind of cold that cracked wood and froze the water in the snares before the animals could reach the bait. But the snow stopped, and the sky cracked open just enough for movement. Beckett sent his rider to Harlan the next morning, carrying 2 letters. One describing the situation in Ash Hollow and requesting emergency supply dispatch. The other, a formal request for a land agent to assess an improvement claim on the northern acreage of the former Voss homestead. Lenora wrote out the second letter herself, in the careful hand Thomas had always praised and she'd always been mildly vain about, and gave it to the rider directly. "Don't let that one get combined with the other," she said. 2 separate envelopes. 2 separate deliveries if need be. The rider, young, maybe 20, with the slightly overwhelmed expression of someone given an important task he wasn't sure he was equal to, nodded seriously. "And ride fast," she said. "Not recklessly, but fast." He went. The days that followed were the hardest stretch of the cavern encampment, not because things were getting worse. They weren't. The storm was gone, and the sick were mostly improving, and the food was holding. But because the immediate crisis had eased just enough for people to start feeling their actual circumstances. Survival mode burns very clean. When you're in it, you don't have space for much beyond the next task and the next hour. When it lifts, even slightly, everything you've been burning through floods back in. People cried. Not dramatically, not breakdown crying, but the quiet, private kind, which was almost harder to witness. A woman named May Holloway sat against the wall one afternoon with her head on her knees and her shoulders moving, and Lenora came and sat beside her without touching her or saying anything, just being there, the way Bruno had sat with Lenora in the early dark weeks of November, when crying had been the only thing that felt true. After 10 minutes, May Holloway straightened up and wiped her face with her sleeve and said, "My husband is in Harlan with his brother. I don't know if he knows what's happening." "He'll know soon," Lenora said. "The writer will bring news back both ways." May nodded. "He's going to be so angry at me," she said. Not unhappily, almost with tenderness. "For what?" "For not having more flour stored. He's been saying since September—" She stopped. "He's going to say I told you so, for the rest of our lives." Lenora looked at her. "When he walks through that cavern entrance to get you, he's not going to say anything except thank God." May Holloway looked at her for a moment, then nodded again, differently, like she'd needed to hear it said out loud by someone who wasn't her. Lenora stood up and went back to work. She had an ongoing conflict with the ventilation fissure. It was the most technically demanding thing she'd been managing since the encampment began, and she'd been managing it alone because she was the only one who fully understood the relationship between the fissure and the cavern's air quality. Too much cold air from outside came through when the wind shifted direction, and too little airflow meant the fire smoke built up in the upper chamber until people started coughing. It was a constant negotiation, adjusted with a plug of compacted moss she'd fashioned specifically for the purpose, inserted and removed in increments depending on wind and fire and the density of human occupation in the main chamber. She'd been going up to check it every 4 hours, including in the night, which meant she was climbing the natural stone shelf to the fissure, doing her assessment, adjusting the plug, climbing back down. A process that took maybe 8 minutes, but 8 minutes at 2 in the morning after 6 weeks of inadequate sleep was becoming the thing she thought about most during the day, in a way that told her she was approaching a wall of some kind. On the 9th day after the storm broke, she climbed up to adjust the fissure at the midnight check and found that the plug had been repositioned. Not to the setting she'd left it, but to a setting she recognized as what the ventilation needed in the current conditions. Better, actually, than what she'd had it at. More precise. She hung on the stone shelf for a moment, looking at it. She climbed back down and went to the fire where Walt Garver was on watch. "Did you adjust the fissure plug?" she said. He looked up. "Watched you do it 4 or 5 times," he said. "Figured out how it worked. You look tired." She looked at him for a long moment. "The wind shifts overnight from northwest to north," she said. "When it goes north, you want the plug in about 2 fingers further than what I had." "Notice that," he said. "You can take the midnight check," she said, "if you're going to be up anyway." He nodded. No ceremony. She slept 4 hours straight for the first time since October. It was on day 11 of the clear period, day 17 of the encampment, that the rider came back from Harlan. She heard the commotion at the cavern entrance, voices, movement, the particular quality of noise that meant news. And she came from the supply area where she'd been doing the daily inventory. People were clustering near the entrance passage. Beckett was already there, and Orson and the young rider stood in the middle of the main chamber, still wearing his coat and his pack, face red from cold, slightly wild around the eyes, in the way of someone who's been carrying a large thing a long way and wants to put it down. "Supply train is coming," he said, loud enough that the cluster of people heard it, and the information spread back through the cavern in a wave she could track by the sound of it. 3 wagons, out of Harlan, left the day after I arrived. They should be 2, maybe 3 days behind me. A sound from the assembled people that was not quite cheering and not quite crying, but lived somewhere between the two. "And the other matter," Beckett said quietly to the rider, looking briefly toward Lenora. The rider pulled an envelope from his coat and held it out. Lenora took it. She didn't open it immediately. She put it in her own coat pocket and looked at the rider. "Did you eat today?" she said. He blinked. "Ma'am, did you eat?" There was a stop at the Miller place. They gave me—" "Sit down," she said. "I'll get you something proper." She fed him first. Then she went to the side chamber, the smaller one, the one with the secondary spring, her space, and she sat down and opened the envelope. The letter inside was from a man named Garrett H. Pruitt, land agent, operating out of the county seat in Harlan. It was 3 paragraphs and used the particular formal language of legal correspondence that she'd had to learn to read from Thomas's dealings with the bank. The language that means more than it says and says less than it means. She read it twice. Then she sat with it for a minute. "The law regarding improvement claims in this territory," Pruitt wrote, "recognize continuous habitation and material improvement of land as a basis for title claim that could challenge or supersede a landholder's claim to that land in cases where the original debt did not specifically encumber that portion of the acreage." The key phrase, as far as Lenora understood it, was that last one. Did not specifically encumber. The loan Thomas had taken, she knew this, she'd read the papers 3 times in October, had been secured against the cabin, the north field, and the equipment, not against the mountain acreage, which had been considered worthless land, too steep to farm, too remote to develop. Crowell's survey might place the cavern within the boundary of the original deed, but the loan that had triggered the foreclosure had not touched it, which meant that Crowell's claim rested on the deed, which rested on the loan, which had not covered this land. He might be right that the land was part of the original homestead. He might be entirely wrong that it reverted to him with the rest of it. Pruitt said he would need to review the original deed documents and loan instruments to give a formal opinion, and he would need to visit the site in spring to assess the improvements. He ended with a sentence that was as close to encouragement as a land agent's letter ever got. "Based on your description of your habitation and improvements, Mrs. Voss, I believe you have a substantive claim that merits full legal examination." She folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. She sat quietly for another minute and listened to the sound of the main cavern. People reacting to the news about the supply train, voices overlapping, someone laughing for what might have been the first time in a week, a child asking a question she couldn't make out, Bruno's nails on stone as he moved between groups in his self-appointed role of community ambassador. Then she stood up and went back out. Beckett found her 10 minutes later. "Well?" he said. "There's a case," she said. "Whether I win it depends on things neither of us can know yet, but there's a case." She looked at him. "Did you know the loan didn't encumber the mountain acreage?" He was quiet for a moment. "I suspected it might not," he said carefully. The original survey that Thomas used for the deed application only measured the farmable land. The mountain acreage was appended without a separate valuation. Crowell knows this too, she said. He's known it all along. Beckett met her eyes. Crowell knows a lot of things, he said. Knowing them hasn't always stopped him. No, she said. But other things can. She was thinking about public opinion, which was a currency Crowell hadn't needed to manage carefully in a long time because he'd had all the money. In a small frontier community, reputation was its own kind of deed. You could hold it or lose it, and what you did in a crisis was one of the fastest ways to determine which. She was thinking about 35 people who were going to go back to Ash Hollow carrying a specific memory of who had kept them warm and who had tried to find an angle in it. She was thinking about Silas Crowell standing outside her cavern in the cold trying to negotiate, and how that story would sound when those 35 people told it. The supply wagons, she said, when they arrive. I want to be part of the distribution conversation. Beckett looked at her. You want a say in how the emergency supplies are allocated? I want more than a say, she said. I want us to use this as the moment to build something. Not just get through the winter, build something that means next winter, and the winter after, this doesn't happen again. She looked at him steadily. This town almost died because it had no reserve, no plan, and one man with too much power over too many essential things. That's not a weather problem, Mayor. That's a structure problem. Beckett was quiet for a moment. He was a pragmatic man who thought in terms of what was achievable, which was what made him a functional mayor, and she could see him assessing the distance between where they were and where she was pointing. That's a larger conversation, he said. I know it is. I'm not asking you to solve it today. I'm asking you to start it. He looked at her with an expression she'd been seeing more of over the past 2 weeks. Not quite deference, not admiration exactly, but a kind of recalibrated respect, the specific respect of a person who has been wrong about another person in a way they're still working out the full dimensions of. All right, he said, we'll start it. That evening, with the news of the supply train still warm in everyone's minds, and the mood in the cavern lighter than it had been since arrival, Crowell came back. He came at dusk, and this time he didn't come alone. He brought his man Tench and a third man she didn't recognize, who had the look of someone Crowell had been keeping in reserve. Formal coat, briefcase strapped to a pack. The particular bearing of a man whose professional purpose was the production of documents. She met them at the entrance. Orson materialized at her left shoulder without being asked, which she was grateful for, and said nothing, which she was more grateful for. Crowell looked at the three of them. Mrs. Voss, I have a legal representative with me. I'd like to discuss the formalization of the bank's claim to this property. I've heard from a land agent in Harlan, she said. Something shifted in his face. Rapid, controlled. He'd known she would do this. She could see that he'd expected it, but the timing was ahead of his schedule. Whatever Pruitt has told you, how did you know it was Pruitt? A pause. Very small. There are only 2 agents in the county, he said. There are 3, she said. Pruitt, Aldous, and a new man named Corbin, who set up in Harlan last spring. She held his gaze. You knew it was Pruitt because you've already spoken to him, or tried to. Crowell said nothing. She'd guessed. She hadn't known. But the guess had landed on something solid, and she could feel it underfoot. Pruitt told me my claim merits full examination, she said. I imagine he told you something similar about yours, given that the loan instrument didn't encumber the mountain acreage. She watched his face. Whatever you're planning to do, Mr. Crowell, do it in the courts in spring. Not here. Not tonight. She looked at the man with the briefcase. There's no document I'm signing this evening. The man with the briefcase looked at Crowell. Crowell looked at Lenora, and she understood, in the particular quality of that look, that this was the moment he'd reassess. Not retreat, not abandon. Men like Crowell didn't abandon their positions, they repositioned them. But reassess. Recognize that the terrain had changed, and that the tools he'd been planning to use were not the right tools for this terrain. We'll resolve this in the spring, he said. Yes, she said, we will. They left. She stood at the entrance and listened to their footsteps recede down the mountain path, and then she looked out at the night sky, which was clear for the first time in weeks, a hard black with stars so sharp they seemed to be cutting through the dark from the other side. Orson appeared beside her, blowing into his hands. He's not done, Orson said. No, she agreed. He'll come at it differently in the spring. Probably. Are you worried? She thought about the letter in her coat pocket, about Pruitt's careful language, about 35 people inside this cavern who were alive and warming and eating because of what she'd done in a place Crowell hadn't even known existed until a trapper nearly died on his way home and followed the steam. "I'm worried about the ventilation fissure," she said. "Walt Garver thinks he's got it, but the wind's been variable today, and I want to check it before I sleep." Orson looked at her sideways. "That's not what I asked." "I know," she said. "Good night, Orson." She went inside, checked the fissure. Garver had it right. He'd had it right since the third day. And did her circuit of the cavern in the dark. The sick were improving. The old woman was sleeping soundly, which had become the most reliable barometer she had for the cavern's temperature. Too cold and she'd wake, and you'd know. Clara Beckett, 17 days out from the worst of her fever, was asleep on her side with Bruno warm against her back, his amber eyes catching the faint firelight. Lenora crouched beside them for a moment. Bruno's tail thumped once, softly, on the stone. "Good boy," she said quietly, so as not to wake anyone. She went to the supply area and did the inventory by feel and by count. Because she'd done it so many times, she didn't need light to do it anymore, and the count was where she needed it to be. And the wagons were 2 or 3 days away, and for one moment, just one, short, not something she dwelt on, she let herself feel the full weight of what she'd done. She'd come here with nothing, she'd built something from nothing, and she was not going to give it up. She sat with that for the length of one breath, and then she put it away and lay down on her stone floor with her blanket and her coat and her dog's warmth against her feet, and she let herself sleep. The supply wagons arrived on the third morning after the rider, just as he'd estimated, coming up the mountain path that Orson and Walt Garver and 3 other able-bodied men had spent 2 full days clearing with shovels borrowed from the town's emergency stores. Lenora heard them before she saw them. The particular sound of wagon wheels on packed snow, the breathing of draft horses working hard on an incline, the voices of drivers calling to each other through the cold. She was at the entrance when the first wagon came into view around the switchback below the cliff face, and she stood there with her arms at her sides and watched it come, and felt something loosen in her chest that had been knotted since approximately the first day of November. 3 wagons, Harlan livery horses, big and steady. The drivers were bundled to their eyes. The wagons were loaded with canvas-covered cargo that she could identify partially by shape: flour sacks, the rectangular bulk of preserved goods crates, what looked like a rolled canvas that might be a tent or extra blankets. Behind the wagons, on horseback, came a man she didn't recognize, compact, 50s, wearing a coat that said professional rather than frontier. He had a leather satchel strapped across his chest, and he was looking at the cliff face with the specific attentiveness of someone who'd been told to look at the cliff face and take note of it. Garrett Pruitt, she understood. The land agent hadn't just sent a letter. He'd come himself. She had not expected that. The cavern behind her was already in motion. She'd heard the stir start the moment people caught the sound of wagon wheels, the particular excited rustling of people who have been waiting for something and suddenly believe it might actually arrive. Beckett came to stand beside her at the entrance without a word. Then Orson. Then, one by one, others, until there was a loose cluster of people spilling out onto the snow in front of the cavern, blinking in the winter light. The first driver pulled his team to a stop and looked down at them from the bench. "Ash Hollow?" he said. "Part of it," Beckett said. "The part that's still alive." The driver looked at the cavern entrance, at the steam rising from it, at the collection of people around it. His expression cycled through several things in quick succession. "In the mountain," he said, not quite a question. "Underground spring," Lenora said. "It kept the temperature livable. Get those horses out of the wind before you unload. There's a windbreak below the first switchback." The driver looked at her, then at Beckett, then back at her. "She's in charge," Beckett said. The driver nodded like that was the most straightforward thing anyone had said all morning and clicked his team into motion toward the windbreak. Garrett Pruitt dismounted and came toward them, and she understood within the first few seconds of meeting him that he was a man who'd done this long enough to have run out of the part of himself that was impressed by things. He shook Beckett's hand and then looked at Lenora with the direct assessment of someone doing an appraisal. Not unkindly, just professionally. "Mrs. Voss," he said, "you're younger than I expected." "I get that," she said. "I'd like to see the improvements before we talk law," he said, "if that's all right." "Come in," she said. She walked him through the cavern the same way she'd walked Beckett through it weeks ago, but this time she watched his face differently. Not for emotional response, but for the technical register, the small professional notes she could see him making without paper. He crouched by the main spring and looked at the water. He stood under the ventilation fissure and held his hand up to feel the draft. He walked the perimeter of the sleeping arrangements, the supply area, the pathways she'd worn between functional zones over 6 weeks of use. He looked at the secondary spring. He looked at the smoke-blackened stone above the fire station and the careful placement of it in relation to the fissure above. He came back to her in the main chamber. "You did all of this in October," he said. "From October 31st, she said. "I can tell you the exact sequence if the dates matter legally." "They may." He looked around once more. "How many people has this space sheltered?" 35 at peak. Some have gone back down as the weather permitted. There are 22 here now. For how long total? We're at 19 days of continuous occupation. He nodded slowly, like things were falling into place. "The loan instrument," he said. "You have a copy?" "I have Thomas's copy." She'd kept it. In the coat pocket, folded since October. She'd taken it from the house, not for legal reasons, but because it had been in Thomas's desk drawer and leaving it had felt wrong. "I don't have the bank's copy." "I do," Pruitt said. He patted the satchel. Crowell's office provided it. He thought it supported his claim. "I read it differently." He met her eyes. "The encumbrance in that loan is specific. The north field, the homestead structure, the equipment and livestock. The language they used, a standard form actually, didn't extend to unimproved acreage. Your husband attached the mountain parcel to the deed after the loan was already executed." "I didn't know that," she said. She said it carefully, wanting it to be the truth and checking that it was. "I knew Thomas had added the mountain land to the deed. I didn't know about the timing relative to the loan." "Most people wouldn't." Pruitt looked at her evenly. "What it means is that when the loan defaulted, the bank acquired what the loan covered, which was the farmable homestead, not this." He gestured at the cavern around them. "This land was appended to the deed, but not to the loan, and it hasn't passed to the bank because the bank's claim was never against it. The simple logic of it sat there in the warm air of the cavern, plain and solid." "He knew this," Lenora said. "He likely suspected it," Pruitt said carefully. "Whether he knew for certain depends on how carefully his lawyers read the instrument. I would guess they read it carefully and decided the risk of challenging you was manageable, and that intimidation might accomplish what the law wouldn't." "It didn't," she said. "No," Pruitt agreed. "It didn't." He stayed 2 days, Pruitt did, sleeping in the cavern with everyone else and eating the same food and asking questions of Lenora, of Beckett, of Orson, of Dr. Hale, with the quiet thoroughness of a man building something that needed to hold weight. On the morning of the 3rd day, he produced documents and sat with Lenora at the flat stone she'd been using as a work surface since November and walked her through what he'd prepared. A formal improvement claim. 40 acres, as surveyed by his own measurements during the 2 days of his visit, encompassing the cavern, the springs, and the surrounding land to a boundary that gave her functional control of the resource. Without being so broad, it invited challenge on other grounds. The claim was filed against the original deed, not the bank's foreclosure holding, on the specific legal argument he'd outlined in the cavern. The loan hadn't covered this land, so the bank's claim hadn't either. She read every word. Twice. "Where does Crowell challenge this?" she said. "He challenges the survey. He argues the boundary. He argues the improvement threshold." Pruitt folded his hands. "He does not have a clean argument on the core legal question, which is the loan encumbrance. That's his weakest ground, and he knows it. And if he takes it to court, then you go to court." He looked at her steadily. "In a county court, in a territory where homestead improvement law is taken seriously, with 19 days of occupation documented, the testimony of 35 people this property sheltered, and a doctor's record of the lives that were preserved here." He paused. "I've been doing this for 23 years, Mrs. Voss. I can't promise you outcomes, but I can tell you what I'd bet on." She signed the document. Her hand was steady. Crowell got the news within 2 days, which in Ash Hollow meant he probably got it within 2 hours. Lenora was back in the cavern when Beckett came to find her, wearing the expression of a man delivering news he wasn't sure how to frame. "He's furious," Beckett said. "I assumed. He's talking about fighting it. His man Tench has been going around town talking about outside money, investors, developing the spring commercially. He paused. Some people are listening. Of course they are, she said, without particular heat. Money talks. It does. Beckett sat down on the stone bench she'd created against the wall, which had become an unofficial meeting place over the weeks. But here's the thing, Lenora. He'd started using her given name somewhere in week 2 of the encampment, and she hadn't corrected him. Crowell's been talking to outside investors, and the town's been talking to itself. Those aren't the same conversation. She looked at him. I called a meeting, he said. Night before last, after you'd gone to sleep. The people who are still up here, and I sent word to the ones who'd already gone back down. About 12 came up from town. He looked at the cavern floor, then back at her. We voted on a resolution, unanimous, which I'll admit surprised me, because Devers was there and he voted with everyone else. He reached into his coat. 40 acres, legal deed, town's name on the transfer paperwork as guarantor of the claim. Signed by me, by the town council, by the pastor, and by old Mrs. Alderman, who insisted on being included and who, frankly, I didn't have the nerve to refuse. He held out the paper. She took it. It was a single page, cleanly written in Beckett's careful hand, and it said in plain language what he'd described. The town of Ash Hollow, by unanimous resolution of its residents, recognized and affirmed Lenora Voss's claim to the 40 acres encompassing the mountain cavern and its springs, and pledged to support that claim by testimony and by any legal means available to the community. It wasn't a legal deed. It wasn't what Pruitt's filing was. But it was 30-some people putting their names to something that said, this is right, this is hers. We know what she did, and we are saying it plainly. She sat with it in her hands for longer than she intended. It's not enough on its own, she said finally. No, Beckett agreed, but it's not nothing either. No, she said, it's not nothing. She folded it carefully and put it in her coat pocket beside Pruitt's copy of the improvement claim and Thomas's original loan document, which she'd been carrying since October like a talisman she hadn't known the use of yet. The winter took another 6 weeks to fully release its grip. The supply wagons came twice more from Harlan, and each time Lenora was part of the distribution conversation the way she'd told Beckett she intended to be. Not controlling it, she wasn't trying to run the town, which was a job she had no interest in, but present, with a voice that had weight because she'd earned it in a way that was impossible to argue around. She pushed for the community reserve that had been her condition since the beginning. A stored supply of food, medicine, firewood, and blankets that was held in common and managed transparently, with a formal system for how struggling families accessed it before they reached the point of crisis. It was not a radical idea. In most places, some version of it already existed, but Ash Hollow had been run on Crowell's model, which was the model of individual accumulation. You stored your own, you survived your own crisis, and if you couldn't, you borrowed from the bank at terms the bank set. What Lenora was describing was different. The town as a body that took care of its members, not as a charity, but as a practical matter, because the cost of letting people fail was higher than the cost of keeping them stable. Some people pushed back. Not many, after the winter they'd just had, but some. Devers came to her one afternoon, the same Devers who'd been making corners uncomfortable for weeks, and stood in front of her with the particular expression of a man who's going to say something he doesn't fully want to say. The reserve, he said. I want to understand how decisions get made about who gets what. Transparently, she said. A committee of 5, rotating, elected by residents. Anyone can see the inventory. Distribution decisions are documented. And if someone disagrees with a committee decision, they bring it to a town meeting, she said. Same as any other town business. He looked at her for a long moment. That's more democratic than I expected, he said. What did you expect? I thought you'd want to run it, he said. Not accusatory, just honest. She looked back at him equally honestly. I want the system to work, she said. I don't need to be the one running it. Those are different things. Devers nodded. Something in him settled, visibly, like a question he'd been carrying around had been answered to his satisfaction, even if not in the way he'd anticipated. He became one of the 5 original committee members. He was not an easy committee member. He pushed back constantly, asked questions that were sometimes inconvenient, required things to be explained more thoroughly than everyone else wanted to bother with. But he was thorough, and he was present, and he showed up for every meeting, which was more than could be said for everyone. Lenora thought sometimes that she'd misjudged him, and then she'd remember the corners and revise that thought. She hadn't misjudged him. She'd just seen one side of a more complicated person, which was something she'd been learning to hold alongside the other things she knew about people that winter. The people in Ash Hollow were not villains. They hadn't abandoned her because they were bad. They'd abandoned her because they were afraid, and afraid people do the small, survivable thing, the thing that doesn't cost them anything today, and pay for it later in ways they don't always connect back to the original choice. She understood that now in a way she hadn't in October, standing on her porch watching them stay behind their windows. Understanding it didn't undo it, but it changed what she carried when she thought about it. Silas Crowell's challenge came in March, through a lawyer in Harlan named Ebbets, in the form of a counterfiling that argued the boundary of the improvement claim and contested the sufficiency of the habitation documentation. It was a professional filing, thorough, with language designed to make the process expensive and slow. Pruitt had anticipated most of it. He'd prepared responses in advance, filed quickly, and sent Lenora a letter with the measured confidence of a man who'd already seen the other side's hand and found it shorter than his own. But it was going to take time. The court date wouldn't come until late spring, maybe summer. She kept working. The cavern in spring was different than the cavern in winter. Warmer outside meant the differential between the spring's heat and the mountain air changed, and she had to relearn some of her management habits for the new season. She was still up there every day, checking the ventilation, maintaining what she'd built, planning the improvements she'd been designing in her head since November. A proper entrance with a constructed door rather than packed moss. A more stable fire station, a series of wooden platforms to get sleeping areas off the stone floor, a storage room for the community reserves she'd negotiated into existence. Orson helped with the construction. Walt Garver came up on weekends, which she hadn't asked for but didn't decline. Two men from town she hadn't known well before the winter arrived one Saturday morning with tools and asked if there was anything useful they could do, and she put them to work immediately and efficiently enough that they came back the following Saturday. People started coming to the cavern not just to help, but to sit in it. In the evening sometimes, a family or a couple, coming up the mountain path to sit near the spring and be warm in a way that went beyond temperature. She didn't entirely understand it at first, and then she did. Places where people have survived something become different from other places. They hold the memory of it in their walls, or maybe people just carry their own memories into them, and the place becomes the container. Either way, the cavern had become something to Ash Hollow that she hadn't built it to be and hadn't predicted. It was theirs now, in a way she hadn't expected and was still working out how she felt about. Hers, legally. Theirs in the way of shared experience. Both true, not in conflict once she'd thought about it long enough. Ruth's baby came in late February. A girl, healthy, born in the side chamber with Dr. Hale and the Callahan mother assisting, because the cavern was still the safest warm place in the region, and Ruth had made no secret of her preference. Lenora had been present not as a midwife, she wasn't one, but because it was her space, and because Ruth had asked her to be there, and she hadn't known how to say no to that particular request from that particular woman. The baby came in the small hours of a February morning, and the first sound she made echoed off the cavern walls and came back slightly transformed, softer, and Ruth held her daughter and looked at Lenora across the dim room with an expression that was so complete it didn't need any language attached to it. "She needs a name," the Callahan woman said, in the practical tone of someone who'd been through this 3 times. "I know," Ruth said. She looked at her daughter, then at Lenora. "Is it strange if I want to name her after this place?" Lenora thought about it. "The cave?" she said. "The spring," Ruth said. "The warm place in the mountain." She paused. "I was thinking Vera. It means true. It means—" She stopped, reconsidering. "It means something that's real when everything else is hard to believe." Lenora looked at the baby, who was the red-faced, indignant, entirely specific person that all newborns are. "Vera's a good name," she said. The court date came in June. It was not a dramatic proceeding, which Lenora had half expected and half feared. Ebbets made his arguments. Pruitt made his. The judge, a methodical man named Harrogate, who had clearly read all the filings and had opinions about them, asked pointed questions of both sides, and took the case under advisement for 1 week before returning his decision in writing. He found for Lenora. The loan had not encumbered the mountain acreage. The improvement claim was valid. 40 acres, the cavern, the springs, and the surrounding land were hers by legal right, and the bank's claim to them had no standing in law. Crowell could appeal. Ebbets told him he could appeal. He didn't. Lenora heard this from Beckett, who came to find her at the cavern 3 days after the ruling, and she received the news the way she'd received the worst of the winter, without ceremony, without performance, just as information that needed to be processed and incorporated and moved forward from. He's selling, Beckett said, the banking interests. He's been in contact with a bank out of Denver, apparently. Been in contact with them for a while. He paused. I think he saw this coming, and he'd already started looking for the exit. Good, she said. It'll change the town's financial situation, Beckett said. Not necessarily for the worse. The Denver bank may be more flexible. Or maybe the same thing with a different name, she said. Possibly. He looked around the cavern, which in June was not the desperate shelter it had been in December, but still warm, still the same ancient mineral smell, still Bruno's domain in the way that large dogs make themselves the guardians of whatever space they decide belongs to their person. What will you do with it, Beckett said, now that it's settled? She'd thought about this. She'd been thinking about it since March, when the legal outcome had begun to feel more likely than not. Build, she said, a proper structure at the base of the mountain. A real home this time, not what the bank says I can afford, but what I can build with my hands and with help. She looked at the cavern walls. And keep this going. The winter reserve system, the community stores. Use this place the way it deserves to be used, as insurance, as the thing that means the next bad winter doesn't take anyone. Beckett nodded. People will help with the building, he said. More than you expect. I know, she said. And she did know. Over the spring, she'd watched the town's relationship with her shift in the incremental, unannounced way that real changes happen. Not a proclamation, not a ceremony, but a series of small acts that accumulated into a different kind of standing. Orson and his meat. The baker's wife who sent bread up the mountain every Friday, not as payment for anything, just as a gesture that had become habitual. The blacksmith who'd appeared one April morning with 2 cooking grates he'd made for the cavern kitchen without being asked, and without making any comment about them beyond, "Where do you want these?" None of it was absolution. None of it was offered as absolution, which was important. They weren't trying to make her forgive them, they were just trying to be different, which was the only thing you could actually do about the past, she'd come to understand. You couldn't undo it. You could decide to be different going forward and then actually be different, and that was the full extent of what was available to a person in that situation. She was working on accepting that as enough. The house went up in late summer. A modest place, 2 rooms, solid construction, set at the base of the mountain where she could see the cavern entrance from her front step. A dozen men from town contributed labor over 3 Saturdays, and Orson framed the walls, and Walt Garver laid the floor, and Dr. Hale, who turned out to have grown up in a family of builders, did the roof joinery with a precision that Lenora noted and appreciated. The day she moved in, which was less an event than a process, given that she had almost nothing to move and had been living in the cavern for 8 months, she sat on her front step in the late August evening and looked up at the mountain face. The steam from the cavern entrance was visible, thin in the summer heat, barely there, but visible if you knew where to look. She knew where to look. Bruno came and lay across her feet, which he'd been doing since October, and which she had stopped noticing only because it had become as natural as the sound of her own breathing. She thought about Thomas, not with the raw ache that had made his name a wound in those first months, with something older and quieter. She thought about the way he'd taught her to build a fire, and the way he'd been wrong about the harvest, and the way he'd put the mountain land on the deed as an afterthought, because he'd liked having it, liked the idea of owning a piece of the mountain even if neither of them could imagine what use it would ever be. She thought about the wooden box of his brother's letters that she'd left in the cabin, and realized she didn't know if she'd ever know what was in them. There was a version of her that would have gone back for that box once the winter was over. The version that had actually lived through the winter had other things to think about, and had made a kind of peace with the things that were simply gone. Thomas would have had opinions about all of it, about the cavern, the legal fight, the winter encampment. He'd have agreed with most of her decisions and argued with two or three of them, and the argument would have ended with him being right about one of them, and they'd both have known which one, and she'd have incorporated it without making a speech about it because that was how it had worked between them. She missed that. The specific collaboration of being known by someone who could also be right when she was wrong. She sat with that missing for a while. Let it be what it was. Then she got up, because there was still an inventory to do, and the ventilation plug needed checking before the mountain got cold at night, and she had no one to do either of those things but herself. She did them. She came back and ate dinner and read by lamplight until her eyes gave out, which they did earlier than she'd like, and she slept in a bed for the first time since October, which was a stranger sensation than she'd anticipated. Too soft, almost, after 8 months of stone. She woke once in the night, habit, and lay in the dark listening for the sounds that would tell her the cavern needed attention. Nothing. The mountain was quiet. She went back to sleep. In the autumn, before the first cold, the town held its first formal meeting to review the community reserve system, inventory, distribution procedures, the committee's work over the summer, plans for the coming winter. It was held in the meeting hall, which had been the pastor's space before it became the town's proper space, as Ash Hollow had grown into something more complicated than a frontier settlement held together by one man's money. Lenora sat near the back. She'd thought about not coming. She'd thought, in the days before the meeting, about what it meant that she was being asked to attend a formal civic proceeding about a system she'd proposed. In a town that had watched her walk away in October with 4 pounds of beans and a dog, and had not come forward to help. Whether sitting in that meeting hall was something she could do without the old anger rising in a way that made her useless. She came. She sat near the back. She listened. Devers ran the committee report, which he did with a thoroughness that was both exhausting and, she admitted to herself, reassuring. Every sack of flour accounted for, every distribution decision documented, every family that had drawn from the reserve named, without shame, as a matter of record rather than charity. The committee had been particular about the distinction, which had been one of her conditions, and which Devers had, to his credit, enforced with consistency. The pastor proposed a name for the reserve system. Someone in the back of the room made a joke about naming it after Crowell. The laughter was brief and not entirely comfortable. Then someone, she didn't see who, said her name. "Call it the Voss Reserve," the voice said, "for what she did and where it came from." A quiet moment. "That's the most sensible thing anyone said all evening," said old Mrs. Alderman from the front row, at a volume that suggested she'd given up worrying about whether she was being heard. Nobody disagreed. Lenora, in the back row, looked at the floor. She didn't stand up and make a speech. She didn't deflect it and tell them to call it something else. She just sat with it. The particular discomfort of being recognized by people who'd once been unable to recognize you, and the complicated work of receiving that without either dismissing it or letting it undo you. It was not a complete reckoning. Nothing was. Towns don't transform overnight, people don't, and there were still people in Ash Hollow who'd cross the street and not quite meet her eyes. And she understood this was about their own discomfort with what they'd done rather than anything she was doing now, and she gave them the space for it without necessarily being at peace with it. But the people who'd come up the mountain that December had come back down different. She could see it at the small things. The way the Callahan family nodded to her when they passed, differently than before, with a directness that hadn't been there in October. The way Ruth stopped by the house twice a month and sat on the front step with baby Vera and talked about nothing in particular, which was the most domestic and ordinary kind of connection and the kind that Lenora had missed more than she'd admitted to herself. The first winter after was not like the winter before. Cold came the same way it always came, without asking permission. But the town had 2 months of reserve food and firewood, and it had the cavern stocked and ready. And when a family out on the East Road lost their roof in November snow, they had somewhere to go that wasn't charity and wasn't the desperate mountain trek in a blizzard. They just went. It worked the way she'd designed it to work. Not perfectly. Nothing works perfectly. And there were arguments about distribution and a committee meeting in January that nearly came apart over a disagreement about flour that she heard about secondhand and was glad she hadn't been present for. But it worked. The town got through the winter with everyone alive. The winter after that, the same. The reserve grew. People added to it not because they were required to, but because they'd started to think about it as their own, the same way they thought about the road or the well. something that belonged to everyone, and therefore to each of them specifically. The cavern got its proper door. The wooden sleeping platform she'd sketched in her head during the worst of November got built in the second autumn by a rotating team of volunteers who'd started treating the maintenance as their contribution to something shared. Bruno grew old. This happened slowly and then faster than she was prepared for, the way it always does with dogs, the way life does the math differently than people do. He was gray around his face by the second summer and slower on the mountain path. Though he still came, still insisted on the check of the cavern entrance and the investigation of any new smell with the professional gravity of a creature who took his responsibilities seriously. The children of Ash Hollow, the Callahan children, Clara Beckett, who was 11 and then 12 and then 13, baby Vera, who became walking Vera and then talking Vera with opinions, knew Bruno the way children know the permanent fixtures of their world, as simply there, as part of the landscape. He tolerated this with patience that Lenora suspected was genuine rather than performed. He'd always had more patience for children than for most adults. She was standing outside the cavern entrance on a November afternoon in the third year when she understood something she'd been approaching for a long time. The steam was rising, thin and steady, the same way it had risen on the night she'd first seen it from below, stumbling through the storm with Bruno's back under her hand and nothing in front of her but cold and dark and the dog's certainty. She was looking at it and she was thinking about nothing specific, just the steam and the mountain and the particular slant of late autumn light. She hadn't saved these people because she was good. She'd been told that, various ways, by various people over the years since, and she'd always had trouble fitting herself into that story. She'd been angry. She'd been calculating. She'd made the decision to open the cavern the way you make a decision you've already made before you know you've made it. Not from pure generosity, but from the part of yourself that is still, underneath everything else, connected to other people whether you want to be or not. She'd looked at frightened children coming through the snow, and the connection had simply been there, the same as it had always been, unasked for, inconvenient, ultimately inescapable. That was the thing she'd learned, maybe. Not about strength, not about survival, though she'd learned those things too. The thing underneath those things, that you cannot fully separate yourself from the people around you, no matter how good your reasons are. They will be in you anyway. Their crises will find the part of you that hasn't closed yet. You will feed them your rabbits and your beans and your warmth and your judgment and the system you spent 6 weeks alone in the dark building from nothing, and the part of you that wanted to keep it for yourself will always, in the end, come in second. She wasn't sure this was comforting. She wasn't sure it was supposed to be. But it was true, and she'd stopped having much patience for things that weren't. She looked at the steam for another minute. Then she went inside, checked the ventilation, adjusted the plug 2 fingers north the way Walt Garver had taught himself 3 years ago, and taught her in a quiet reversal she'd received without comment, and began the inventory of the winter reserves. Numbers were good. Numbers were honest. Numbers told you exactly where you were. She was where she'd built herself to be. She began to count.